The Hennessy name was never meant to be whispered in fear, never meant to be written in the annals of Ireland's most notorious gangland. Was not born into the underworld, nor was he raised with a gun in his hand. He was a fighter, a man who once stood in the ring as a promising young boxer, his fists a weapon of sport rather than survival. He knew discipline, he knew struggle, and he knew how to take a punch and throw one back even harder. But the streets of Dublin have a way of choosing their own champions, and for Jason Hennessy Sr., the path of the righteous was never as rewarding as the path of power. What began as small-time dealings, favor trading, money runs, protection rackets, soon spiraled into something far darker. The same fists that once cracked jawlines under the bright lights of a boxing ring would come to break bones in darkened alleyways, not for sport, but for control. The Dublin underworld is not a place for the weak. The lines between survival and dominance blur, and men like Hennessy learned quickly that mercy is nothing more than a weakness to be exploited. In the shadowed corners of the city, deals were struck in hushed voices, alliances were made and broken with the pull of a trigger, and reputations were built not by words, but by the fear they instilled. Hennessy had no illusions about the nature of his rise. Every inch of territory gained was soaked in blood. His was a world where the only law that mattered was the law of the gun, and the only loyalty that lasted was the kind bought with money or fear. By the late 2010s, Jason Hennessy Sr. had solidified his name among the key figures in Dublin's gangland. He was no longer the young boxer dreaming of a title. He was an enforcer, a strategist, a man whose reputation alone could make rivals think twice before crossing him. His operations spanned from drug distribution to extortion, his connections reaching into some of the most powerful criminal networks in the country. The men who once fought beside him in back-alley brawls were now his foot soldiers, his trusted circle of enforcers who ensured his name was spoken with respect, and more importantly, with fear. But power in the underworld is fleeting. It is an illusion that men like Jason Hennessy Sr. learn to wield with confidence, even as they know deep down that it cannot last. The power he had accumulated, the enemies he had made, it all painted a target on his back. The whispers of betrayal came first, murmurs of discontent among the younger generation of criminals who sought to carve their own names into the underworld. He had seen it before, men who built empires only to watch them crumble when their own men turned against them. The warnings had been there. The tension had been rising. Rivals had been circling, watching for the moment when the great enforcer would lower his guard. And on Christmas Eve 2023, that moment arrived. A quiet evening at Brown's Steakhouse turned into a bloodbath. Gunshots shattered the festive calm, and within moments, the feared crime boss lay bleeding, the life draining from a man who had once seemed invincible. Dublin's gangland had claimed another victim, and in his death, a new battle began. Not just for revenge, but for the very future of his criminal empire. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. The Hennessy name, once a symbol of unshakable control, was now a house of cards trembling under the weight of uncertainty. Associates who once swore loyalty to Jason Hennessy Sr. began weighing their options. Some sought to align themselves with rising power players. Others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk sharing his fate. And at the center of it all were his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing in the shadow of a murdered kingpin. Now the focus shifts to them. Left with a fractured legacy and a name soaked in blood, they are faced with the ultimate question. Will they rise to reclaim their father's throne, or will they be the next victims in Dublin's relentless cycle of gangland warfare? The Hennessy story is not just another tale of crime. It is a testament to the brutal reality of gangland power, a name built in blood, a name that still echoes in the streets of Dublin, and a name that may yet be written in its history forever. To understand the rise of Jason Hennessy Sr., one must first understand the landscape that shaped him. Dublin's underworld is not just a collection of criminals. It is an evolving, shifting entity, built on the blood and ambition of those who dare to take what they believe is theirs. It is a battleground where alliances are fragile, betrayals are inevitable, and the rules of survival are written in bullets and banknotes. For decades, Dublin's criminal underworld has been dominated by a handful of powerful factions. The old-school gangs, deeply embedded in the city's history, once ran operations with a certain level of structure, a hierarchy where respect mattered almost as much as violence. But as the years went on, a new breed of criminal emerged, more ruthless, more unpredictable, less concerned with codes of honor and more focused on immediate power. The 1990s and early 2000s saw an explosion in Ireland's drug trade, fueled by international cartels and the growing demand for narcotics across Europe. Dublin became a key hub, a city where shipments of cocaine and heroin flowed like currency. As money flooded the streets, so too did violence. Disputes between rival factions escalated into all-out wars, with bodies turning up in alleyways, execution-style killings becoming routine, and gang leaders becoming high-profile targets. It was in this chaotic, blood-soaked environment that Jason Hennessy Sr. made his rise. The old ways of doing business were crumbling, and those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were erased. Hennessy was a man who understood the nature of this new, ruthless underworld. He saw the changing landscape, and rather than fight against it, he became a part of it. A strategist as much as a brute, he built alliances where necessary, eliminated threats when required, and positioned himself as a man to be feared. Dublin's criminal underworld is not a place for the faint-hearted. It is a system built on greed, fueled by desperation, and ruled by those willing to go further than their enemies. Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson well, and in mastering the game, he secured his place in its history. But as with all who rise in this world, the higher they climb, the further they have to fall. As his influence grew, so too did the enemies watching from the shadows. And in Dublin's underworld, a rise to power is never permanent. It is only a matter of time before the streets demand their due. Dublin, a city steeped in history and culture, is also a city where gangsters rise and fall in cycles, as predictable as the tides. The criminal underworld is a beast that devours its own, an empire built on violence that ensures no one stays at the top for long. And Jason Hennessy Sr., despite all his cunning, was no exception. Jason Hennessy Sr.'s path into the criminal underworld was not one of inevitability, but of choices. Decisions made in the grim alleys and neon-lit backstreets of Dublin, where survival often comes at the cost of morality. Before he was a feared crime boss, he was a young fighter with promise, a man whose fists spoke louder than words, had solidified his name among the key figures in Dublin's Gangland. He was no longer the young boxer dreaming of a title. He was an enforcer, a strategist, a man whose reputation alone could make rivals think twice before crossing him. His operations spanned from drug distribution to extortion, his connections reaching into some of the most powerful criminal networks in the country. The men who once fought beside him in back-alley brawls were now his foot soldiers, his trusted circle of enforcers who ensured his name was spoken with respect, and more importantly, with fear. But power in the underworld is fleeting. It is an illusion that men like Jason Hennessy Sr. learn to wield with confidence, even as they know deep down that it cannot last. The power he had accumulated, the enemies he had made, it all painted a target on his back. The whispers of betrayal came first, murmurs of discontent among the younger generation of criminals who sought to carve their own names into the underworld. He had seen it before, men who built empires only to watch them crumble when their own men turned against them. The warnings had been there. The tension had been rising. Rivals had been circling, watching for the moment when the great enforcer would lower his guard. And on Christmas Eve 2023, that moment arrived. A quiet evening at Brown's Steakhouse turned into a bloodbath. Gunshots shattered the festive calm, and within moments, the feared crime boss lay bleeding, the life draining from a man who had once seemed invincible. Dublin's Gangland had claimed another victim, and in his death, a new battle began. Not just for revenge, but for the very future of his criminal empire. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. The Hennessy name, once a symbol of unshakable control, was now a house of cards trembling under the weight of uncertainty. Associates who once swore loyalty to Jason Hennessy Sr. began weighing their options. Some sought to align themselves with rising power players. Others quietly distanced themselves, unwilling to risk sharing his fate. And at the center of it all were his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing in the shadow of a murdered kingpin. Now the focus shifts to them. Left with a fractured legacy and a name soaked in blood, they are faced with the ultimate question. Will they rise to reclaim their father's throne, or will they be the next victims in Dublin's relentless cycle of gangland warfare? The Hennessy story is not just another tale of crime. It is a testament to the brutal reality of gangland power, a name built in blood, a name that still echoes in the streets of Dublin, and a name that may yet be written in its history forever. To understand the rise of Jason Hennessy Sr., one must first understand the landscape that shaped him. Dublin's underworld is not just a collection of criminals. It is an evolving, shifting entity, built on the blood and ambition of those who dare to take what they believe is theirs. It is a battleground where alliances are fragile, betrayals are inevitable, and the rules of survival are written in bullets and banknotes. For decades, Dublin's criminal underworld has been dominated by a handful of powerful factions. The old-school gangs, deeply embedded in the city's history, once ran operations with a certain level of structure, a hierarchy where respect mattered almost as much as violence. But as the years went on, a new breed of criminal emerged, more ruthless, more unpredictable, less concerned with codes of honor and more focused on immediate power. The 1990s and early 2000s saw an explosion in Ireland's drug trade, fueled by international cartels and the growing demand for narcotics across Europe. Dublin became a key hub, a city where shipments of cocaine and heroin flowed like currency. As money flooded the streets, so too did violence. Disputes between rival factions escalated into all-out wars, with bodies turning up in alleyways, execution-style killings becoming routine, and gang leaders becoming high-profile targets. It was in this chaotic, blood-soaked environment that Jason Hennessy Sr. made his rise. The old ways of doing business were crumbling, and those who adapted survived. Those who didn't were erased. Hennessy was a man who understood the nature of this new, ruthless underworld. He saw the changing landscape, and rather than fight against it, he became a part of it. A strategist as much as a brute, he built alliances where necessary, eliminated threats when required, and positioned himself as a man to be feared. Dublin's criminal underworld is not a place for the faint-hearted. It is a system built on greed, fueled by desperation, and ruled by those willing to go further than their enemies. Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson well, and in mastering the game, he secured his place in its history. But as with all who rise in this world, the higher they climb, the further they have to fall. As his influence grew, so too did the enemies watching from the shadows. And in Dublin's underworld, a rise to power is never permanent. It is only a matter of time before the streets demand their due. Dublin, a city steeped in history and culture, is also a city where gangsters rise and fall in cycles as predictable as the tides. The criminal underworld is a beast that devours its own, an empire built on violence that ensures no one stays at the top for long. And Jason Hennessy Sr., despite all his cunning, was no exception. Jason Hennessy Sr.'s path into the criminal underworld was not one of inevitability, but of choices. Decisions made in the grim alleys and neon-lit backstreets of Dublin, where survival often comes at the cost of morality. Before he was a feared crime boss, he was a young fighter with promise, a man whose fists spoke louder than words. Born into a working-class family, Hennessy Sr. showed early promise in the boxing ring. His quick hands, relentless endurance, and an unbreakable spirit made him a rising star in local circuits. Coaches spoke of his potential, of a future in professional boxing, but the brutal reality of life in Dublin's toughest neighborhoods had a way of pulling young men away from ambition and into something darker. The same traits that made him a dangerous fighter, his discipline, his ability to take punishment, and his sheer force of will, made him an even more formidable presence outside the ring. As he trained, he was drawn into the fringes of Dublin's criminal underbelly. Small-time enforcers began recruiting him for muscle jobs, shaking down debtors, collecting protection money, ensuring that certain people in the neighborhood understood the consequences of stepping out of line. At first, it was just another way to earn money, an easy supplement to the meager earnings from amateur boxing. But soon, the allure of fast cash, respect, and power eclipsed any dreams of championship belts. It wasn't long before Hennessy Sr. had a reputation not just as a boxer, but as a man who could handle himself in any fight, whether inside the ropes or in the back of a nightclub, where deals were settled with fists instead of contracts. The criminal world saw in him something useful, a man who was dangerous but disciplined. Unlike the wild, unpredictable thugs who littered the lower rungs of the underworld, Hennessy had a mind for strategy, for control. He began working closely with more established figures in the Dublin underworld, learning the trade of organized crime. The early years were spent as an enforcer, handling collections and intimidation for the higher-ups. But Hennessy was never content to be a foot soldier. He watched, he learned, and most importantly, he waited. By the late 2000s, Hennessy Sr. had built enough connections to branch out on his own. He was no longer just a hired fist. He was making his own moves, running his own rackets. His transition from enforcer to boss was not a dramatic coup, but a slow and calculated process. He formed alliances, cut out the weak links, and took control of key operations: drugs, extortion, and weapons trafficking. With his reputation solidified, Hennessy Sr. was no longer just a feared enforcer. He was becoming a kingpin in his own right. But the higher he climbed, the more enemies he made. Dublin's criminal world had no shortage of men who wanted power, and as Hennessy expanded his empire, he unknowingly set the stage for the betrayals, conflicts, and bloodshed that would define his reign, and ultimately his downfall. Jason Hennessy Sr. did not rise to power simply by throwing punches and intimidating rivals. The world of organized crime is not sustained by brute force alone. It thrives on money, strategy, and the careful balancing act between control and chaos. To solidify his status as a kingpin, Hennessy Sr. had to master the business of crime. Unlike many gangsters who relied solely on violence, Hennessy Sr. understood that power in the criminal underworld was built on financial strength. He diversified his interests early on, ensuring that his income streams were not solely reliant on drugs. Extortion, loan sharking, arms smuggling, and money laundering became pillars of his empire. He established a network that allowed him to funnel illegal profits through legitimate businesses: bars, nightclubs, construction firms, all of which provided a facade of respectability while masking the dark underbelly of his operation. His most profitable venture, however, was the drug trade. As the demand for cocaine surged in Dublin and beyond, Hennessy positioned himself as a key player in the supply chain. His connections with international traffickers ensured a steady flow of narcotics, which were then distributed through a network of street-level dealers. He did not micromanage street operations himself. Instead, he delegated power, ensuring loyalty through financial incentives and ruthless enforcement. But with great wealth came great threats. Dublin's Gangland was not a peaceful kingdom where one man could rule unchallenged. Rival factions saw Hennessy's success and sought to take a share of his profits. The underworld was a volatile ecosystem, and alliances were often as fragile as the peace they brokered. Feuds were inevitable. Disputes over territory, unpaid debts, and betrayals led to open warfare in the streets. Hennessy Sr. was not one to shy away from violence when necessary. He understood that fear was as valuable a weapon as any firearm. Those who opposed him were met with swift and brutal consequences. Disappearances, shootings, and public executions became messages sent to those who dared challenge his authority. The blood feuds that defined Dublin's criminal history were not new, but Hennessy played the game differently. He did not engage in reckless violence. Every action was calculated. He preferred to remove threats quietly, using intimidation, bribery, and if necessary, targeted assassinations carried out by trusted hitmen. His ability to balance business acumen with raw aggression made him one of the most feared figures in Ireland's criminal underworld. But with every empire built on crime, there is always a tipping point. As his wealth and influence grew, so too did the pressure from law enforcement, rival gangs, and even those within his own ranks who sought to betray him. The stage was set for the inevitable downfall. The question was not if Jason Hennessy Sr. would fall, but when and at whose hands. Jason Hennessy Sr. may have built a criminal empire, but power in the underworld is never undisputed. Every inch of territory he controlled, every euro he made, came at the expense of someone else, someone who was just as ruthless, just as hungry, and just as willing to kill for control. For every gangster who rose, there were a dozen more watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to take it all away. His enemies were not just faceless rivals. They were men who had once shared drinks with him in backroom meetings, criminals who had stood beside him in alliances of convenience before greed and ambition turned them into adversaries. Dublin's criminal landscape had always been volatile, but by the time Hennessy had reached his peak, the city had become a battleground of shifting allegiances and open warfare. In the early years of his rise, Hennessy had to contend with Dublin's older criminal factions, established figures who had been running the city's drug trade and extortion rackets for decades. These were men who followed a certain code, a set of unspoken rules that kept the underworld from descending into absolute chaos. But Hennessy was not one for tradition. He was part of a new wave of gangsters, men who saw no value in playing by old rules when there was more money to be made by breaking them. This put him at odds with some of the more established figures in Dublin's gangland scene. At first, they tried to control him, offering him a place within their ranks in exchange for loyalty. But Hennessy had no interest in being a subordinate. He was not content with taking orders, he wanted to be the one giving them. When he refused to bow to the old guard, tensions escalated. At first, it was through subtle warnings. Business deals falling apart, shipments being hijacked, informants mysteriously disappearing. But soon the conflict turned bloody. The first real test of Hennessy's strength came in the form of a targeted hit. One of his lieutenants was found dead, his body dumped in an alleyway as a message: stand down or face the consequences. It was a direct challenge, one meant to intimidate him into submission. But instead of retreating, Hennessy retaliated. Within days, one of the men suspected of orchestrating the murder was found executed in his car, 2 bullets to the head in classic gangland fashion. It was a message in return. Hennessy was not afraid to fight back. From that point on, the city became a chessboard of strategic killings, bombings, and street-level clashes. The police struggled to keep up as bodies continued to pile up, and the streets of Dublin became a war zone. As Hennessy expanded his operations, his most dangerous enemies were not just the old guard criminals, but the new highly organized drug cartels operating out of West Dublin. These groups had deep connections to international suppliers, including Spanish and Dutch drug lords who funneled massive amounts of cocaine and heroin into Ireland. Hennessy wanted a bigger share of the drug trade, but the cartels saw him as a threat, an unpredictable wildcard who didn't respect the established distribution channels. Tensions boiled over when one of Hennessy's crews intercepted a shipment that was meant for a rival faction. The response was immediate and brutal. A safe house owned by Hennessy's gang was firebombed, killing 2 of his men inside. It was clear that this was no longer just a turf dispute. It was an all-out war. The violence escalated to levels unseen in years. Cars were rigged with explosives. Contract killers were flown in from Eastern Europe to carry out assassinations. Dublin became a city under siege, and Hennessy was right in the middle of it. But the deadliest threats to Hennessy didn't always come from rival gangs. In the underworld, the closer someone is to you, the more dangerous they become. As the pressure mounted, paranoia began to seep into his organization. Whispers of informants within his ranks reached his ears, and soon trusted allies were turning up dead, executed on nothing more than suspicion. The authorities, seeing the chaos unfold, ramped up their investigations. Key figures in his operation were arrested, and some, facing decades behind bars, chose to talk. One of his most trusted enforcers, a man who had been with him from the early days, turned state witness in exchange for immunity. It was the ultimate betrayal. With every detail he gave to the police, the walls around Hennessy began to close in. By 2022, Jason Hennessy Sr. was fighting battles on all fronts. The police were closing in, his rivals were getting bolder, and his once loyal men were either dead or turning against him. He had built an empire through force, but now that same force was being used to tear it apart. The war could only end one way, with either total victory or complete annihilation. Hennessy knew it, and so did his enemies. Every move from this point forward would be a gamble with life and death hanging in the balance. And then came the hit that changed everything. The Christmas Eve assassination that sent a message to all of Dublin. Jason Hennessy Sr. had made too many enemies, and in the end, one of them got to him first. Christmas Eve is a time of celebration, a night when families gather, streets are lit with festive cheer, and even the hardened criminals of Dublin's underworld lower their guards for a moment of respite. But in the world of organized crime, there is no true peace, only opportunities. And on December 24th, 2023, Jason Hennessy Sr. learned this lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. He had been cautious in his final months, more wary than usual. The streets were whispering, warning of a reckoning long overdue. Hennessy knew he had made too many enemies, played the game too aggressively, left too many bodies in his wake. But power breeds arrogance, and for all his paranoia, he still believed himself untouchable. His network was strong, his reputation even stronger. Few would dare move against him. And so, on that fateful Christmas Eve, Hennessy walked into Brown's Steakhouse in Blanchardstown, a well-known establishment frequented by high-profile figures, both legitimate and otherwise. He was not hiding in the shadows, not moving under the cover of darkness. He was in plain sight, enjoying a meal as if he were still the king of Dublin's underworld. The assassin knew this was the moment. Gangland executions are not random acts of violence. They are calculated, methodical, designed to send a message. Hennessy's murder was no different. Eyewitness accounts later painted a picture of chilling precision. The killer had entered the restaurant unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the festive crowd. No masks, no hurried movements, just a man on a mission. He knew where Hennessy was sitting, knew exactly how much time he had before security, police, or retaliation could follow. Then came the gunshots. Silence turned to chaos in an instant. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the holiday atmosphere, sending patrons diving for cover, glasses smashing, tables overturned in the panic. Hennessy was hit multiple times, center mass, a shot to the neck, and one final round to the head to ensure the job was done. He never had a chance to react, never had time to reach for a weapon or call for his men. In seconds, a criminal empire that had taken years to build was left in ruins, its leader bleeding out on the floor of a high-end steakhouse. Who ordered the hit? Theories and suspects. As the news broke, speculation ran wild. Hennessy had no shortage of enemies, but the nature of the hit suggested more than just personal revenge. It was a strategic move, a message to the entire underworld. Several theories emerged almost immediately. A rival syndicate's power play. The most obvious explanation was that a competing criminal organization had finally decided to eliminate Hennessy. With him out of the picture, his operations were vulnerable, ripe for the taking. Internal betrayal. In the world of organized crime, danger often comes from within. Had one of Hennessy's own men turned against him, lured him into a false sense of security, only to deliver the final blow? Perhaps someone close to him saw the writing on the wall and decided to make their move before they became a target themselves. Cartel involvement. Some speculated that the assassination had been orchestrated by international drug suppliers. Hennessy's increasing ambition had placed him in dangerous waters, stepping on the toes of powerful figures beyond Ireland's borders. Law enforcement's silent hand. While unlikely, there were murmurs that authorities had allowed the hit to happen, turning a blind eye in order to rid Dublin of one of its most dangerous criminals without the need for lengthy legal battles. Dublin's underworld does not simply absorb a blow like this and move on. The murder of a crime boss of Hennessy's stature sent shockwaves through the entire network of criminals, enforcers, and dealers who operated under his influence. Fear gripped his associates. Without their leader, they were vulnerable. Some immediately sought to distance themselves, hoping to avoid the inevitable fallout. Others saw opportunity, maneuvering to claim what remained of his empire. The police response was swift, but largely symbolic. Roadblocks were set up, raids were conducted, but those who truly understood gangland affairs knew that justice, at least in the traditional sense, would never come. There would be no witnesses willing to speak, no smoking gun to tie the killer to a specific organization. This was a professional job, carried out with precision, ensuring that the identity of those responsible would remain shrouded in secrecy. What was clear, however, was that the Hennessy reign had come to an end. But even as the crime boss lay dead, his legacy was far from over. In the days following his assassination, attention turned to his sons. Young, ambitious, and now standing at a crossroads. They could fade into obscurity, abandon their father's criminal path, and carve out their own lives. Or they could embrace the blood-soaked legacy left behind, stepping into the void that his death had created. And in the underworld of Dublin, power vacuums never last for long. When a king falls, the vultures circle. Jason Hennessy Sr. had spent years building his reputation, carving his name into Dublin's underworld through violence, strategic alliances, and sheer force of will. But in the criminal world, power is fleeting. The moment a crime boss is taken off the board, his empire begins to unravel. Trust dissolves, allies reconsider their loyalties, and rivals sharpen their knives. Hennessy's assassination was not just the end of a man. It was the beginning of a war. Dublin had seen its fair share of gangland killings, but this one was different. Hennessy was not a disposable foot soldier, not just another name on the ever-growing list of fallen criminals. He was a power player, a man whose influence reached deep into the criminal economy. His network had extended beyond just drug dealing. He controlled extortion rings, protection rackets, money laundering operations, and had strong ties to international suppliers. And now all of it was up for grabs. Within hours of his death, the balance of power had shifted. His men, once fiercely loyal, now found themselves directionless, uncertain of what came next. Some disappeared into the shadows, unwilling to die in a war they had no stake in. Others immediately sought new allegiances, offering their services to rival factions in exchange for security. The empire Hennessy had built was fracturing at its core, and every gang in the city saw an opportunity to claim a piece of it. In the wake of Hennessy's assassination, three major forces moved to stake their claim over his criminal operations. The rival factions, the West Dublin cartels, longtime competitors of Hennessy's empire, saw his death as a golden opportunity. These organizations, well connected to international drug suppliers, had been waiting for a moment like this. With Hennessy gone, they could absorb his street-level dealers, take over his distribution networks, and eliminate any remaining opposition. The Loyalists. Not everyone was willing to let go of the Hennessy legacy. A faction of his closest enforcers, men who had been with him since the beginning, vowed to protect his name. But without a clear leader, they lacked direction. The question remained, who would rise to take command? The Hennessy sons, the most unpredictable element in the equation. While they had been raised in the shadow of their father's empire, they had never held real power. Now, with their father's empire crumbling, they had a choice: walk away or fight to reclaim what was theirs. Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother had grown up in a world where crime was business, violence was a tool, and power was everything. They had seen their father operate, learned the rules of the game from a young age. But watching from the sidelines and stepping onto the battlefield were two very different things. In the days after their father's assassination, the brothers were left with an impossible decision. If they walked away, they could escape the cycle of bloodshed that had defined their father's life. They had the money, the connections, and the opportunity to start fresh. But in the underworld, walking away is rarely that simple. Their father's name was still feared. His legacy had weight. And with his death, many of his associates, men who had built their lives under his protection, looked to them for guidance. To some, they were the rightful heirs to the empire. To others, they were nothing more than boys playing at a man's game, untested and vulnerable. For the Hennessy sons, stepping into their father's shoes was not just about reclaiming power, it was about survival. If they did not take control, someone else would. And in the world their father had built, weakness was a death sentence. Jason Hennessy Jr. wasted no time in making his intentions clear. Within days of his father's funeral, he called a meeting of his father's remaining loyalists. The location was carefully chosen, neutral ground, a place where no one could pull a gun without suffering immediate consequences. The message was simple. The Hennessy name was not finished. But words were not enough. The brothers needed to prove themselves, to show that they were not just inheriting power, but seizing it. And in the criminal world, there is only one way to do that: through action. Their first move came swiftly and without hesitation. A known associate of the rival factions, a man suspected of orchestrating their father's murder, was found beaten to death in an alleyway. No witnesses, no cameras, just a silent message written in blood. The Hennessy family was still in play. The response was immediate. The rival cartels, seeing the Hennessy sons as nothing more than a nuisance, began to push harder, applying pressure on their remaining operations. Safe houses were raided, shipments hijacked, and informants strategically placed to feed law enforcement information. The war had officially begun. As the Hennessy brothers fought to maintain control, the rest of Dublin's criminal network watched carefully. Some saw potential, young blood with something to prove, a name still powerful enough to command loyalty. Others saw an inevitable downfall, two inexperienced heirs playing a deadly game they did not fully understand. For the police, this was both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, the infighting within the Hennessy ranks meant more chances to dismantle their network. On the other, it meant more bloodshed, more public executions, and more civilians caught in the crossfire. The Hennessy name was no longer just a symbol of past power. It was a battlefield. The question was no longer who would take power. It was whether the Hennessy brothers could survive long enough to hold on to it. The criminal world is unforgiving. It does not wait for men to grow into their roles, does not offer second chances. The brothers had made their choice, and now they had to prove themselves the only way the underworld understood: through dominance, through strategy, and through sheer, relentless force. The legacy of Jason Hennessy Sr. was built on blood, and if his sons wished to carry it forward, they would have to be prepared to spill plenty of their own. A name can be both a shield and a target. For Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother, their surname carried weight, a legacy built on fear, power, and blood. In the criminal underworld of Dublin, Being the son of a slain crime boss came with expectations. To some, they were the natural heirs to their father's empire, destined to take the reins and continue his work. To others, they were nothing more than boys playing at a man's game, inexperienced and vulnerable in a world that devoured weakness. But one thing was certain: walking away was never an option. With Jason Hennessy seemed dead, his empire was in disarray. The drug trade, extortion rackets, and money laundering operations he had carefully built were now battlegrounds. Rival factions were closing in, waiting for the perfect moment to seize what remained. If the Hennessy brothers wanted to survive, they had to act fast. Before their father's assassination, the Hennessy sons had lived in the periphery of gangland life. While they were no strangers to violence, their father had kept them at arm's length from the worst of it. He had spent years shielding them from the blood-soaked realities of his business, ensuring they were respected but not yet feared. That protection was gone. With their father dead, the brothers had no choice but to step forward. They had seen how quickly power crumbled when left unattended. If they hesitated, they would be erased from the underworld entirely. And so they made their first move. In Dublin's criminal world, power is not inherited, it is taken. The first test of their authority came in the form of retaliation. The whispers on the street had pointed to a few key figures as the masterminds behind their father's murder. Whether the intelligence was accurate or not didn't matter. What mattered was sending a message. Within 2 weeks of Jason Hennessy Sr.'s death, a known lieutenant of a rival faction was found dead. The scene was brutal, a deliberate display meant to instill fear. His body, riddled with bullets, was left on a public street in the early hours of the morning. No attempts were made to hide it. This was not a silent assassination. It was an announcement. The reaction was immediate. The rival factions, seeing the Hennessy brothers as a growing threat, escalated their aggression. Safe houses were raided, drug shipments intercepted, and informants began feeding law enforcement crucial intelligence. The war had officially begun. Despite their bold opening moves, the Hennessy brothers faced an undeniable problem. They had no real experience running a criminal empire. Their father had spent years building relationships, navigating the treacherous politics of gangland life, and balancing alliances with brute force. Jason Jr. and his brother, however, were young, impulsive, and untested. Respect in the underworld was earned through reputation, and they had yet to prove themselves beyond their surname. Some of their father's old associates remained loyal, but many questioned their ability to lead. Were they ruthless enough? Were they strategic enough? Could they hold their own against seasoned criminals who had been playing this game for decades? The brothers knew that one misstep could spell their end. As the brothers fought to secure their father's empire, law enforcement saw an opportunity. With Jason Hennessy Sr. dead, his once well-structured criminal operation had become chaotic. The sudden infighting, the reckless retaliations, and the public displays of violence all played into the hands of the authorities. Surveillance operations intensified. Wiretaps were authorized. Long-standing investigations that had failed to bring down Hennessy Sr. were restructured with one goal in mind: preventing his sons from rising. It was a race against time. If the Hennessy brothers could consolidate power quickly, they could establish themselves as the new leaders of the underworld. If they faltered, they would either end up dead or in prison before they had a chance to make their mark. But leadership is rarely shared, and cracks within the Hennessy ranks were beginning to show. Jason Hennessy Jr., the eldest, naturally assumed the role of leader. He was the face of their resurgence, the one making the critical decisions, the one handling negotiations and issuing orders. His younger brother, however, had a different approach. More impulsive, more prone to reckless acts of violence, he saw fear as the quickest path to dominance. Tensions between them simmered beneath the surface. Some of their father's former associates favored Jason Jr., his measured, strategic approach, believing that brute force alone would not be enough to maintain power. Others, however, gravitated toward his younger brother's ruthless ambition, seeing in him a reflection of their father's more violent tendencies. A divide was forming, one that threatened to collapse their fragile empire before it could even solidify. The Hennessy brothers had made their choice. They would not fade into the background. They would not relinquish their father's empire without a fight. But the path they had chosen was one paved with blood, betrayal, and endless war. Could they hold their ground long enough to establish themselves as true power players in Dublin's underworld? Or were they merely inheritors of a doomed legacy, destined to fall as their father had? One thing was certain: there was no turning back now. The city was watching, their enemies were waiting, and the next move would determine whether the Hennessy name would rise once more or be buried forever. Violence had always been a tool in the Hennessy family's arsenal. It was how Jason Hennessy Sr. had built his empire, through intimidation, brutal enforcement, and the careful application of fear. His sons inherited that philosophy, but unlike their father, they lacked restraint. What had once been calculated displays of power turned into reckless, unchecked brutality. And it was this shift, their inability to control their impulses, that would lead to one of the most shocking gangland crimes in recent memory. The moment the Hennessy brothers took over, they knew they had to prove themselves. But fear is a dangerous currency. Too little, and they would be seen as weak. Too much, and they would become liabilities, both to their own men and to the authorities. Their biggest mistake? They overplayed their hand. The victim was not a major rival, not a cartel boss or a high-ranking enforcer. He was a small-time dealer, a man caught between warring factions. Rumors swirled that he had fed information to a rival gang, or worse, to law enforcement. In the world of organized crime, such suspicions alone were often enough to warrant death. But instead of carrying out a quiet execution, the Hennessy brothers wanted to make an example out of him. The details of what happened next are gruesome, so brutal that even hardened criminals whispered about it in shock. The man was abducted from the streets of West Dublin, thrown into a van, and driven to a secret location where he was held captive for hours. The Hennessy brothers, along with a small group of their most trusted enforcers, took turns interrogating him. But this was never about gathering information. This was about sending a message. Gangland justice is swift and often final. But what the Hennessy brothers did went beyond anything their father had ever sanctioned. The victim was beaten, burned, and tortured in ways that stunned even those who operated in the shadows. Branded with a hot iron, a mark seared into his flesh, forever labeling him as a traitor. Teeth shattered with a hammer, a grim reminder that speaking out had consequences. Cuts and burns, designed not to kill, but to maximize suffering. When he was finally dumped on the streets, barely alive, his body told the story the Hennessy brothers wanted the world to hear. Betray us, and this is what happens. But the message was louder than they had anticipated. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through Dublin's underworld. Even among criminals, there are unspoken rules, limits to how far one can go before the violence becomes bad for business. The Hennessy brothers had not just made an enemy out of one man. They had alienated powerful figures who saw their methods as reckless and unsustainable. Where their father had been feared and respected, they were now feared and hated. Their men began to question their leadership. Was this what the new Hennessy rule would look like? Torture, chaos, and indiscriminate violence? Would their brutality make them untouchable, or would it draw too much heat from both their enemies and the police? The answer came swiftly. The Irish police, already watching the Hennessy brothers closely, now had the justification they needed to launch a full-scale operation against them. This was no longer just another gangland feud. This was national news. The victim, despite his injuries, had survived long enough to become a witness, and the details he provided were damning. Within days, armed raids were conducted on properties linked to the Hennessy gang. Several associates were arrested, and key evidence was seized: phones, weapons, and financial records that painted a clear picture of their expanding empire. But the biggest prize still eluded them: the brothers themselves. Knowing the Garda E were closing in, Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother vanished from public view. They moved between safe houses, using burner phones and trusted associates to communicate. But no matter how careful they were, the walls were closing in. The torture case had changed everything. It had turned the Hennessy brothers from rising crime lords into high-priority targets. Rivals saw weakness in their recklessness, sensing an opportunity to strike while they were distracted by the police. Informants, once too terrified to speak, now saw an opening to cut deals. The Hennessy name, once synonymous with calculated power, was becoming a liability. For the brothers, there were only two choices: double down on their reign of terror and hope to survive the backlash, or find a way to regain the control they had so carelessly lost. The next move would determine their fate. In the world of organized crime, justice is not handed down in courtrooms or decided by juries. It is swift, ruthless, and often final. For those who cross the wrong people, the punishment is not measured in years behind bars, but in pain, blood, and the slow, creeping certainty that death is coming. The Hennessy brothers had embraced this brutal reality. perhaps too much. Their father had understood the power of fear. He had used violence as a tool, a controlled instrument to maintain order and dominance. But Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother had turned it into a spectacle, a display of cruelty that went beyond the unspoken rules of gangland tradition. The torture of their victim had not just sent a message to rivals, it had also sent shockwaves through their own network. And in Dublin's underworld, when a gangster begins making enemies on all sides, the inevitable reckoning is not far behind. Irish organised crime has always operated by a set of unspoken rules, passed down through generations of gangland figures who understood the delicate balance between power and chaos. Violence was necessary, but excessive brutality was bad for business. The old-school criminals, the ones who had built their empires through calculated strategy rather than reckless bloodshed, viewed the Hennessy brothers with growing disdain. Their father had been feared, yes, but he had also been respected. The new generation? They were little more than executioners without restraint, too eager to make statements, too willing to draw attention to themselves. And in the world of gangland justice, that kind of behavior was not tolerated for long. The torture case had painted a target on the Hennessy brothers' backs, and it wasn't just law enforcement that was closing in. Rival factions saw their growing instability as an opportunity to strike. There were whispers in the streets, quiet conversations in the back rooms of pubs, plans being drawn up in the dark corners of Dublin's criminal underworld. The brothers had crossed a line, and now they had to pay the price. The first blow came within weeks. One of their closest lieutenants, a man who had been with them since their father's reign, was found dead in his car. 2 bullets to the head. A professional job. There was no warning, no chance for retaliation. It was a cold, methodical hit, designed to show the brothers that their enemies were moving in. Then came the ambush. A safe house used by the Hennessy gang was firebombed in the middle of the night. The explosion ripped through the building, killing at least 1 associate and severely injuring 2 others. By the time authorities arrived, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew. It was only the beginning. As the violence escalated, the Hennessy brothers were forced into hiding. They could no longer move freely through the city without the risk of an ambush. Safe houses became temporary refuges, abandoned as quickly as they were found. They relied on burner phones, encrypted messages, and a dwindling circle of trusted men. But paranoia is a dangerous thing in the underworld. They began suspecting everyone, associates, old allies, even their own men. The once loyal network their father had built was crumbling under the pressure. Some sought protection under rival factions, willing to trade information in exchange for their lives. Others simply disappeared, choosing to flee Dublin rather than be caught in the inevitable bloodbath. And through it all, the Hennessy brothers knew one undeniable truth. This war would not end until either they were dead or their enemies were. In gangland warfare, there are few things more effective than a public execution. One night, a known associate of the Hennessy brothers was dragged from his home and executed on the street. Witnesses reported masked gunmen, professional and efficient. They fired with precision, leaving the body where it fell, a statement to anyone watching. This was more than just another killing. It was a declaration. The Hennessy brothers were losing control. For the Gardaí, the ongoing bloodshed presented a rare opportunity. Gangland figures were always difficult to prosecute. Witnesses rarely spoke. Evidence was hard to come by, and intimidation kept most informants silent. But the chaos surrounding the Hennessy brothers was different. The violence was drawing attention, and with it came the chance to dismantle their operation once and for all. Surveillance was intensified. Phone lines were tapped. Informants were cultivated from the ranks of frightened former allies. Law enforcement knew that while taking down Jason Hennessy Sr. had been a challenge, his sons were not nearly as careful. And they were right. Mistakes were being made. The brothers were desperate, careless. The empire they were trying to hold on to was slipping from their grasp, and in their attempts to keep control, they were leaving a trail of evidence behind. As the walls closed in, the Hennessy brothers had 2 choices. Strike first, go on the offensive, eliminate their enemies before they could be taken down. Run, disappear before the law, or their rivals could catch them. But the streets of Dublin do not forget, and neither do the men who rule them. Gangland justice is brutal, merciless, and absolute. The Hennessy brothers had built their reputation on fear, on violence, on their willingness to go further than anyone else. Now that same violence was coming for them. The only question was, how much longer could they outrun it? For years, Jason Hennessy Sr. had operated within the shadows, careful, methodical, always one step ahead of the law. His empire had flourished despite constant scrutiny from the Gardaí, who had struggled to pin down evidence solid enough to bring him down. But after his assassination, everything changed. His sons, reckless and impulsive, lacked the discipline that had kept their father out of prison. Where Jason Hennessy Sr. had built his power on calculated moves and careful alliances, his sons had fueled their rise with raw brutality, and that was their greatest weakness. The law had been waiting for them to make mistakes, and now, with their enemies circling and their men betraying them, the walls were beginning to close in. Chabene. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was alive, the Gardaí had struggled to gather intelligence on his operations. His network was airtight, his inner circle deeply loyal, and his ability to operate just outside the reach of the law made him an elusive target. But his sons, they had left a trail of violence too large to ignore. The torture case had been the turning point. It had provided law enforcement with something they rarely got in gangland cases, a witness willing to testify. Despite severe injuries, the victim had survived. And in the weeks following the attack, he became the centerpiece of a new Garda operation aimed at dismantling the Hennessy network once and for all. The case was given top priority. Special units within the Gardaí, those trained to combat organized crime, were assigned to track the Hennessy brothers' movements. Surveillance operations expanded. Wiretaps were authorized. Financial records were scrutinized. And for the first time in years, the law had momentum. The Hennessy brothers had always known that trust was the most fragile currency in the underworld. Their father had maintained an iron grip on his men, ensuring loyalty through both fear and rewards. But after his death, that grip had loosened. The increasing violence, the reckless displays of power, the chaos surrounding their leadership, it all made their associates nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. The Gardaí played on this fear. Slowly, carefully, they began flipping members of the Hennessy gang. Low-level foot soldiers, small-time dealers, and even some of their enforcers, men who had once sworn loyalty to the brothers, now saw an opportunity to save themselves. Deals were made. Confidential informants were placed. Information trickled in. And with every new piece of intelligence, the Gardaí tightened the noose. The first major crackdown came in the form of coordinated raids across Dublin. At dawn, heavily armed Gardaí units stormed multiple properties linked to the Hennessy gang. Safe houses, drug stash points, and known meeting spots were all targeted simultaneously. Over a dozen men were arrested in a single morning. Some were caught with illegal firearms. Others were found with large quantities of cash and drugs, evidence that tied them directly to the Hennessy operation. But the real targets, the brothers themselves, remained out of reach. They had gone into hiding, moving between locations, using burner phones, relying on a dwindling circle of trusted men. The Gardaí knew they were still in the city, but their time was running out. The mistake that changed everything. For all their caution, the Hennessy brothers could not remain ghosts forever. It was a routine traffic stop that sealed their fate. A vehicle, flagged by the Gardaí as potentially linked to the Hennessy gang, was pulled over in the middle of the night. Inside, a courier, one of the few remaining men still loyal to the brothers. His job had been simple: transport money to a safe location, ensuring the gang's financial reserves remained hidden. But he panicked. Instead of keeping his cool, he made a run for it. The chase was short, ending with his arrest. And when the Gardaí searched the vehicle, they found what they had been hoping for: an encrypted phone with direct communication between the courier and the Hennessy brothers. It was the break they needed. Within hours, they had traced the phone's last known locations, identifying several properties where the brothers had likely been hiding. The final phase of the operation was set in motion. The raid was swift, calculated, and overwhelming. A convoy of Gardaí tactical units moved in on a quiet suburban home in West Dublin, a property believed to be the last remaining safe house for the brothers. They had nowhere left to run. Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother were found inside, surrounded by a small group of armed enforcers. For a moment it seemed like they might try to fight their way out, one last act of defiance against the inevitable. But there was no escape. The house was surrounded. Every exit was covered. And as heavily armed officers breached the doors, the brothers knew their reign had come to an end. The arrest was captured on camera, broadcast across news stations, a symbol of the fall of the once feared Hennessy empire. And with them in custody, the final chapter of their criminal legacy was about to be written. The fall of the Hennessy brothers was a spectacle. From their reckless rise to power, their descent into unchecked violence, and their desperate attempts to cling to their father's empire, it had all led to this: arrests in broad daylight, handcuffs tightening around their wrists as cameras captured the final moments of their freedom. For the Gardaí, it was a victory years in the making. For the streets of Dublin, it was the closing of one chapter in a never-ending cycle of gangland power struggles. But for Jason Hennessy Jr. and his younger brother, it was the beginning of something far worse than death: prison, trials, and the slow unraveling of everything they had built. From the moment news of their arrests broke, the Hennessy brothers became front-page material. Journalists, crime analysts, and former law enforcement officials dissected their every move, recounting their violent history, the brutality of their reign, and the ruthless efficiency with which they had dismantled rivals. Television debates speculated on the trial ahead, while newspapers ran exposés on their empire, detailing drug shipments, money laundering operations, and connections to international crime syndicates. The public, long accustomed to gangland violence, now had faces to go with the headlines, and with that exposure came an undeniable truth. The Hennessy brothers were no longer just criminals. They were symbols. To some, they were cautionary tales, proof that no gangster could outrun the law forever. To others, they were martyrs of the streets, young men who had been forced into a life they never truly controlled. But in the courtroom, neither public opinion nor reputation would save them. From the moment they were processed, the legal system moved quickly. The Gardaí, knowing the brothers were high-profile targets, placed them in protective custody, ensuring they made it to trial without incident. The charges against them were staggering: aggravated assault and torture, tied directly to the case that had sparked the final police crackdown; murder and conspiracy to commit murder, based on intelligence linking them to at least 2 high-profile gangland hits; drug trafficking, large-scale operations that extended beyond Ireland, with confirmed ties to international suppliers; illegal firearm possession; weapons seized during raids, some linked to previous criminal activity; money laundering, millions of euros funneled through shell businesses, a practice inherited from their father's operation. For prosecutors, this was more than just another gangland trial. This was their chance to dismantle what was left of the Hennessy empire, to send a message to the next generation of criminals waiting in the wings. The state was seeking maximum sentences. The brothers, if convicted on all charges, were looking at life in prison. The first day of the trial was chaos. Hundreds gathered outside the courthouse: journalists, rival gang members, and even supporters of the brothers who saw them as products of their environment rather than masterminds of organized crime. Security was tightened, with armed officers positioned at every entrance. Inside, the prosecution laid out their case with brutal efficiency. They painted the brothers as violent, power-hungry criminals who had escalated gangland violence to unprecedented levels. They brought forward witness after witness: former associates turned informants, forensic analysts, victims of their crimes. Surveillance footage, phone records, financial documents, all were presented in a damning sequence that left little room for doubt. The defense, however, had its own strategy. Their lawyers argued that while the brothers had been involved in illegal activities, they were not the masterminds the prosecution claimed. They shifted blame to rivals, disputed evidence, and attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of key witnesses, especially the informants, many of whom had cut deals with the state in exchange for lighter sentences. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the prosecution's case was strong. And then the unthinkable happened. Oi, Iswadibi as a deal on the table, will the brothers turn? As the evidence mounted, whispers began circulating. Were the Hennessy brothers considering cutting a deal? To the outside world, it seemed impossible. Their father had ruled by fear, had built an empire based on loyalty and silence. To betray the code of the streets was to sign one's own death warrant. But the reality of life behind bars was different. The brothers knew they were outmatched. The case against them was airtight, the witness testimonies overwhelming. A life sentence loomed over them like a guillotine, and even prison was no guarantee of survival. So when prosecutors quietly offered a reduced sentence in exchange for key intelligence on Dublin's criminal networks, the question became, would they take it? If they did, they would walk free someday. If they refused, they might never see the outside world again. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. Jason Hennessy Jr. sat expressionless, his younger brother tense beside him. The judge read the decision, count by count. Guilty. The words rang through the room, sealing their fate. For their most serious crimes, murder, torture, and drug trafficking, they received consecutive life sentences. The empire their father had built, the power they had tried to reclaim, it had all ended with the cold steel of prison bars. And as they were led away, shackled and surrounded by guards, the streets of Dublin erupted in a mixture of triumph and fury. Ni adi sa'a. With the Hennessy brothers locked away, the underworld was left in a state of flux. Their empire, once vast and feared, had crumbled. Rival factions moved in to claim what remained, carving up the drug trade, dividing territories, and rewriting the rules of the city's criminal landscape. But even behind bars, the brothers were not entirely powerless. Would they orchestrate revenge from within prison? Would they survive the inevitable attacks from rivals also serving time? Or had the cycle finally ended? In the underworld, nothing stays buried forever. And though the Hennessy brothers had been silenced, their name still carried weight. A name that, for better or worse, would never be forgotten. No empire exists in isolation. The Hennessy crime family was not just a group of ruthless gangsters operating in a vacuum. Their rise and ultimate fall was deeply intertwined with Dublin's wider criminal network, a web of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals that stretched far beyond just one name. Even with the brothers behind bars, the underworld they had fought to dominate was still shifting, still evolving, still carving out its next rulers. Their downfall had not just left a power vacuum in their own organization, it had sent ripples through the entire criminal landscape, and those ripples would shape the future of organized crime in Dublin for years to come. The Hennessys were powerful, but they were never the only game in town. Dublin's criminal network was made up of multiple factions, each with their own areas of influence, each playing their own game of power and survival. With the brothers locked away, a new battle began. Not just between rival gangs, but between the men who had once stood beside them. The Kinahan cartel had long been one of the most dominant forces in Irish organised crime. Their reach extended far beyond Dublin, stretching into the UK, Spain, and even the Middle East. Their control of the drug trade was absolute, their financial power unparalleled. Unlike the Hennessy operation, which was rooted in local gangland politics, the Kinahans operated on an entirely different level, structured, professional, almost corporate in their efficiency. For years, Jason Hennessy Sr. had managed to exist alongside them, careful never to step on their toes. But his sons had been reckless. Their unrestrained violence, their increasing ambition, it had made them a liability, and some believed the Kinahans had played a role in ensuring their downfall. With the Hennessys out of the picture, their influence grew even stronger. They absorbed key players from the remnants of the empire, secured more territory, and continued to run their operations with the kind of discipline that had kept them at the top for so long. But even giants can fall. International law enforcement had been tightening the noose around the Kinahans for years. With major figures within the cartel now wanted men, the once untouchable empire was facing pressures that even their wealth and power might not withstand. And that meant opportunities for others. While the Kinahans dominated international drug smuggling, it was the West Dublin cartels that controlled much of the street-level distribution. These groups were violent, unpredictable, and far less structured than their larger counterparts, and they had been waiting for this moment. With the Hennessys gone, they moved quickly to claim the territories and drug routes that had once belonged to them. Former Hennessy enforcers, left without leadership, were quickly recruited, offered protection in exchange for loyalty. What made these cartels particularly dangerous was their lack of hierarchy. Unlike the old-school crime families, these were looser affiliations of criminals, operating in smaller independent cells. There was no single leader to target, no clear structure to dismantle, and that made them almost impossible to stop. Perhaps the most dangerous development in the aftermath of the Hennessy collapse was the rise of a new generation of criminals. Young men who had grown up watching gangsters like Jason Hennessy Sr. rule the streets only to see his sons fall in spectacular fashion. These were not the old-school criminals who understood restraint, who knew when to strike and when to wait. They were reckless, fearless, and desperate to make a name for themselves. For many, the downfall of the Hennessy brothers was not a warning, it was an invitation, a sign that power could shift, that new players could rise if they were willing to be brutal enough, daring enough, and ruthless enough. And so the cycle of violence continued. Organized crime does not exist without connections. The Hennessy empire had been built not just on violence, but on relationships. Relationships that extended beyond the underworld and into the very fabric of society. The question that lingered in the wake of their downfall was simple. Who had helped them stay in power for so long? It was no secret that corruption had always played a role in Ireland's law enforcement history. The Gardaí had fought tirelessly against gangland crime, but in every system there were cracks. Some officers had turned a blind eye to Hennessy operations in exchange for payoffs. Others had actively fed information to the gang, warning them about upcoming raids, providing them with just enough knowledge to stay one step ahead. Now, with the brothers in prison, investigations were quietly underway into just how deep that corruption ran. Names were being whispered, internal affairs was watching, and reputations were hanging in the balance. It wasn't just the police. The criminal economy in Dublin was a multi-million euro enterprise. And with that kind of money, influence spread far beyond the streets. Developers who needed problems to disappear from construction sites. Business owners who paid protection fees to ensure their shops weren't burned to the ground. And politicians, some of whom had been accused of taking donations from untraceable sources, money that had undoubtedly passed through criminal hands at some point. While no one in the political sphere would ever admit to direct involvement, the question remained. How much had the system tolerated, ignored, or even benefited from the Hennessy operation while it was still thriving? With the Hennessy brothers in prison, the war for control was far from over. Would the Kinahans continue to dominate? Would the West Dublin cartels rise to take their place? Would the new generation of criminals, more reckless and unpredictable than ever, plunge the city into another cycle of bloodshed? Or would law enforcement, finally armed with enough intelligence, strike a fatal blow to Dublin's criminal empires once and for all? For the Hennessy brothers, their time was up. But for the underworld they left behind, the real battle was just beginning. Dublin's gangland history is filled with stories of rising criminals, men who clawed their way to power through violence, intimidation, and strategic alliances. But the Hennessy brothers, despite their ambition, were never the true apex predators of the underworld. That title belonged to the Kinahan cartel. To understand why the Hennessys ultimately fell, one must examine the organization that towered above them, an empire so vast that it made local Dublin gangs look like petty criminals in comparison. The Kinahans were not just another crime syndicate. They were an international machine, corporate in structure, global in reach, and untouchable for decades. And when the Hennessy brothers stepped too far into their domain, their fate may have been sealed long before they ever realized it. Unlike the chaotic street-level operations of most Dublin gangs, the Kinahan cartel functioned with military precision. Their leader, Daniel Kinahan, transformed the organization into one of the most formidable criminal enterprises in Europe, with operations stretching from Ireland to Spain, Dubai, and South America. Where Jason Hennessy Sr. had ruled through force, the Kinahans ruled through structure. They had high-level connections in banking, politics, and international trade. Their drug shipments came in by the ton, not the kilogram. They didn't deal in street-corner transactions. They controlled entire supply chains, port authorities, and logistics companies that made their narcotics pipeline nearly invisible to law enforcement. And crucially, they knew how to eliminate threats. If you were an ally, you thrived. If you were a rival, you disappeared. The Hennessy brothers had tried to rise too quickly, expanding their operations in a way that inevitably placed them in the cartel's crosshairs. Their reckless violence had drawn attention. Their erratic leadership had destabilized criminal networks, and worst of all, they had started interfering with drug routes, personnel, and cash flow that didn't belong to them. For the Kinahans, this was unacceptable. In the world of organized crime, assassinations are rarely random. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was executed, speculation immediately turned to his many enemies. But there was always the question of whether the Kinahans had orchestrated the hit behind the scenes. The cartel had a long history of wiping out problematic figures in Irish crime. The infamous Hutch-Kinahan feud had already left a trail of bodies across Dublin and Spain, proving that the cartel had no hesitation in eliminating threats publicly and with overwhelming force. So when Hennessy Sr. was gunned down in Brown's Steakhouse, many insiders whispered the same question. Had the Kinahans decided he was becoming too much of a liability? For years he had been tolerated, useful in his own way, but never truly in control. However, his sons were a different story. Their reckless ambition and their inability to maintain order made them dangerous, not just to themselves, but to the delicate balance of power that the Kinahans had spent years crafting. The cartel thrived on stability, a structured system where their operations could function without unnecessary attention. The Hennessy brothers? They were chaos incarnate, and chaos is bad for business. It is entirely possible that the Kinahans didn't need to pull the trigger themselves. They simply let their rivals handle it, allowing the Hennessys to self-destruct under the weight of their own reckless violence. But whether they were directly involved or not, one fact remained. The Hennessys were gone, and the Kinahans remained standing. The collapse of the Hennessy operation did not mean an end to their business. It meant a transfer of power. The Kinahan cartel moved quickly to seize the most valuable assets left behind, ensuring that whatever the Hennessys had built would now serve them. The Hennessy brothers had controlled key supply lines, but without their leadership, those routes needed new owners. The Kinahans, already deeply embedded in international drug smuggling, absorbed the remaining Hennessy dealers, eliminating anyone who refused to switch sides. One of the most critical aspects of organized crime is moving dirty money without detection. The Hennessy family had their own methods: shell businesses, real estate investments, and offshore accounts. But they were amateurs compared to the Kinahans. After their fall, financial investigations found that some of their operations had seamlessly merged with cartel-controlled entities, proving that those who remained loyal to the Kinahans would continue making money, while those who didn't were discarded. For the enforcers, drug runners, and lieutenants who had once served the Hennessys, loyalty meant nothing once their leaders were gone. The Kinahans provided a simple choice: join them and continue working in the trade, with better organization, more resources, and greater security. Refuse and suffer the consequences. Many of the Hennessy foot soldiers saw the writing on the wall. They switched allegiance, choosing survival over a lost cause. But those who had been too loyal to the brothers, too involved in their violent feuds, found themselves systematically hunted down. For years, the Kinahan cartel had seemed untouchable. But recently, global law enforcement agencies, including the U.S., DEA, and European police forces, have made dismantling the Kinahans a priority. Sanctions have been placed on key figures. Millions of euros in assets have been frozen. High-profile cartel members have fled to Dubai, Spain, and other safe havens, trying to escape the ever-growing reach of international authorities. For the first time in decades, their iron grip on Irish organized crime is beginning to crack. And the question now is, the Hennessy brothers tried to become something greater, to carve out their own legacy in the underworld. They failed, but their story is not unique. Dublin's criminal history is a repeating cycle of rise and fall, where new names emerge, new factions rise, and old ones are buried in shallow graves. The Kinahans still hold the throne, but law enforcement pressure is at an all-time high. Their enemies are waiting for weakness, hungry for the chance to claim power for themselves. So as one empire collapses and another fights for survival, the streets remain the same: blood-soaked, ruthless, and always waiting for the next king to claim the crown. No gangster ever truly rests in peace. In the underworld, death is rarely the end of a story. It is the beginning of something far worse. A killing isn't just an act of violence. It is a statement, a challenge, a promise of further bloodshed. Every murder demands a response. Every betrayal breeds new enemies, and every empire that falls leaves behind men with scores to settle. The Hennessy brothers may be behind bars, their empire shattered, but their legacy still lingers in the form of unfinished business. The bodies they left in their wake, the lives they destroyed, none of it has been forgotten. And in the world of gangland crime, revenge is never a question of if, only when. The streets of Dublin have long been shaped by cycles of violence that span decades. Gangland history is not simply a sequence of rising and falling crime bosses. It is a chain reaction, where one killing sparks another, where the past never stays buried. The Hutch-Kinahan feud is perhaps the most infamous example. What began as a personal grudge escalated into a war that claimed dozens of lives across Ireland and Spain. With assassinations, public executions, and international manhunts, turning the dispute into one of the deadliest gang conflicts in Europe. The lesson: once a war begins, it rarely ends cleanly. The Hennessy family's downfall did not bring peace to Dublin's underworld. It only created a new power struggle, a new wave of vendettas, and a new generation of criminals waiting to settle old debts. When Jason Hennessy Sr. was assassinated, his death was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of violent rivalries. His sons tried to retaliate, but their reckless attempts only created more enemies than they could handle. Now, with the brothers in prison, the question remains: who still wants payback? Gangsters don't just kill criminals, they kill fathers, sons, and brothers. And in Dublin's underworld, family loyalty runs deep. There are many men still walking the streets whose relatives were murdered, tortured, or disappeared at the hands of the Hennessy gang. Some of them have moved on, others have not. They don't care that the brothers are in prison. They don't care that the empire has collapsed. All they care about is settling the score. The Hennessy brothers didn't just make enemies outside their organization, they made them within their own ranks. As their paranoia grew, they began executing their own men on suspicion of betrayal, turning once loyal enforcers against them. Many of these men switched sides, aligning themselves with rival gangs or law enforcement to survive. But those who escaped now live with the knowledge that their names were once on the Hennessy kill list. For some, that means making sure the brothers never see the outside of a prison cell again. For others, it means ensuring that even prison won't protect them. Power vacuums are dangerous. When a crime boss falls, his territory, money, and influence don't just disappear. They become prizes for the next generation of criminals. But there is an unspoken rule in gangland politics. If you take over a fallen empire, you need to eliminate anyone who could one day claim it back. The Hennessy brothers may be locked away, but they are still alive. That alone makes them a threat to those who now rule Dublin's underworld. Some will argue that they are no longer a problem. Others will insist that as long as they draw breath, they remain potential leaders for a future resurgence. And in gangland law, there is only one way to erase that possibility. Prison is supposed to be a place of punishment and isolation, a place where criminals are removed from the streets and kept under lock and key. But in the world of organized crime, prison is just another battlefield. The Hennessy brothers are not serving their time in a safe, anonymous prison. They are inside a system that is infested with gangland politics, corruption, and hidden agendas. And there are plenty of people inside who want them dead. Dublin's prisons are filled with men whose lives were ruined by the Hennessys. Some were directly targeted, survived assassination attempts, or lost loved ones to their brutal rule. Others simply see them as a trophy kill, a high-profile target whose murder would instantly elevate their own status behind bars. The same criminals who rule the streets also control the prisons. The Kinahan cartel, the West Dublin syndicates, and smaller emerging groups all have influence behind bars. If any of them decide that the Hennessy brothers need to be eliminated, the order can be given, and it won't take long before a weapon finds its way into the right hands. Not every threat comes from inmates. Corrupt prison officers who have long been known to smuggle in drugs, phones, and weapons for the right price could easily be used as tools in a gangland hit. A guard who looks the other way, who unlocks the wrong door, who ensures the cameras malfunction at just the right moment. These are the small details that make the difference between survival and execution behind bars. If they survive, if they manage to outlast the vendettas, the assassination attempts, and the years behind bars, the Hennessy brothers will eventually face the biggest question of their lives. Do they try to reclaim what was lost? Many gangsters never get that choice. They are either killed before release or locked away indefinitely. But if the brothers serve their time and make it out, they will be returning to a city that has moved on without them. The streets they once ruled will belong to new names, new crime bosses, new rivalries. Their father's empire will be a distant memory, their power erased from Dublin's gangland history. Could they rebuild? Could they take back what was once theirs? Or will they be met not with open arms, but with open graves? The Hennessy brothers are not the first crime lords to fall, and they will not be the last. Their story is just another chapter in Dublin's never-ending war for control, a cycle of violence, betrayal, and revenge that has shaped the city for generations. Their legacy, that depends on who writes the next chapter. Because in gangland Dublin, no one stays at the top forever. Blanchardstown in the late 1990s was far from just suburban tranquility. In the shadow of new shopping centres and housing estates, a group of young criminals began to make a name for themselves on the streets. They were dubbed the Westies by Irish media. named after their stronghold in West Dublin's Blanchardstown suburb. What started as a ragtag crew of joyriders and petty thieves from areas like Corduff, Mulhudart and Clonsilla would soon evolve into one of Dublin's most feared drug gangs. By the end of the decade, the Westies had muscled their way to dominance over the local heroin trade, exploiting the boom times of the Celtic Tiger when cash and cocaine flowed freely. In these early days, the gang's core members were barely out of their teens. Childhood pals from the area, like Jason O'Connor and David Goulding, cut their teeth stealing cars and causing mayhem on estate roads. They, and many others, fell under the sway of Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg, the ambitious young men at the helm of the Westies. Coates, the elder statesman in his 20s, was tough and street-smart, while Stephen Sugg, backed up by his loyal younger brother Bernard, was equally ruthless. Together, Coates and Sugg offered the local petty criminals a chance to level up, join the Westies' enterprise and get rich off the drug boom, or stand in their way and suffer the consequences. It was an enticing offer in a place where some kids dropped out of school by age 11 and saw gangsters driving flashy cars as role models. The rise to power was fast and ferocious. As Dublin's economy grew, so did the drug market. The Westies capitalized on exploding demand for heroin and the newfound popularity of cocaine among Ireland's affluent middle class. By the early 2000s, this crew was reportedly pulling in tens of thousands of euro a week, flooding West Dublin's streets with narcotics. With profits soaring, the gang expanded its activities, from armed robberies to extortion rackets, anything that could fill their pockets. But it wasn't just the money that made them infamous, it was the violence. The Westies earned a bloody reputation almost immediately for their willingness to do whatever it took to secure their turf. At the center of the Westies' story are a few key figures whose names became synonymous with terror in Dublin. Shane Coates, often regarded as the Westies' de facto leader, Coates was a Blanchardstown native in his late 20s who had risen through the ranks of local crime. Cold-headed and calculating, he acted as the gang's chief enforcer and shot-caller. Gardaí sources say Coates ordered and in many cases personally carried out some of the most appalling acts of violence imaginable. He was the kind of gang boss who would shoot first and not bother asking questions later. Coates had a charismatically menacing presence. Even among hardened criminals, he was considered one of the most dangerous men on the streets. Stephen Dougie Sugg, co-leader of the Westies alongside Coates, Stephen Sugg was every bit as vicious. In his mid-20s, Sugg brought along his younger brother Bernard Verb Sugg as muscle. Bernard earned the nickname Verb for his motor mouth and swagger, but he was best known for his brutality. He served as an enforcer for the gang, essentially Coates and Stephen's right-hand thug. By all accounts, Bernard was a violent psychopath and a bully, the kind of heavy who thought nothing of pistol-whipping a rival or terrorizing a vulnerable drug user. Together, the Sugg brothers and Coates formed a triumvirate at the top of the Westies, forging a bond in blood and crime. Andrew and Mark Glennon. These two brothers were originally trusted lieutenants in the Westies' ranks. Andrew Madser Glennon, around 30, and his older brother Mark, early 30s, provided extra muscle and helped run the day-to-day drug dealing on the estates. For several years, the Glennons were key enforcers who carried out orders and kept the cash flowing. However, their loyalty would not last forever. The Glennon brothers had ambitions of their own, and their split from the gang would later become a turning point in the Westies saga. Alan Fatpuss Bradley. Though not a member of the Westies' inner circle, Alan Bradley was a contemporary gangland figure whose name loomed large in West Dublin. Based out of nearby Finglas, Bradley led his own criminal outfit and was a major player in armed robberies and drug trafficking across the west and north of the city. Stocky and intimidating, hence the nickname Fat Puss, Alan Bradley moved in the same circles of violence and greed. He and his brother Wayne controlled territory not far from the Westies' turf and were feared locally. As the Westies rose and fell, Bradley was one of those waiting in the wings, an opportunist ready to swoop in on any power vacuum. His path would cross indirectly with the Westies as the battle for Dublin's underworld intensified. These were the main characters in a gangland drama that would grip Dublin. Coates and the Suggs as the ruthless leaders, the Glennons as allies turned rivals, and predators like Fatpuss Bradley hovering at the edges. Each would play a role in the violent saga that unfolded in the early 2000s. For about 5 years, from the late 1990s into the early 2000s, the Westies ruled West Dublin through fear. They didn't just sell heroin, they owned the trade, controlling most of the supply that poured into estates from Blanchardstown to Clonsea. They also dabbled in cocaine, capitalizing on the era's coke boom, and in classic gangster fashion, they shook down local businesses for protection money and knocked off cash-in-transit vans when the opportunities arose. What truly set the Westies apart was their extreme brutality. Even by Gangland standards, this crew's methods were shocking. They enforced their rule with kidnappings, kneecappings, and savage beatings. Drug addicts who owed as little as $10 were not spared. The Westies would drag defaulters into back alleys or abandoned lots and dish out horrifying punishment beatings over pocket change. One report noted that for debts as low as €10, the gang would terrorize the area, dishing out punishment beatings. To make an example, they seemed to revel in intimidation tactics. Kneecapping, shooting a victim through the knee to cripple them, was a favored warning shot. Slashing with blades was another. The gang had a reputation for slicing people up with carpet knives, leaving victims with permanent scars. In one particularly cruel incident, Westies thugs even assaulted a man in a wheelchair. To them, nothing was off limits if it maintained their iron grip on the territory. Extreme violence was practically the gang's calling card. Directed both at rival dealers and their own addicted customers, local residents lived in constant fear. The estates of Corduff and Mulhudart became the Westies' stomping grounds, and the gang acted like warlords. Witnesses to their crimes were terrified into silence. In fact, Gardai later remarked that despite numerous operations against the Westies, no one has ever testified against the leaders. Such is the notoriety of the gang. Intimidation was working. People knew that crossing the Westies or speaking to police could mean a bullet or a beating. A Garda source at the time summed it up bleakly. There would be a fear of retaliation. People are terrified. Even other seasoned criminals were wary of the Westies. They were earning a reputation as Ireland's most feared young gang. Untouchable villains who thought nothing of executing an enemy in broad daylight. Inevitably, the Westies' violent rise put them on a collision course with other underworld figures. The drug trade is never peaceful, and soon the gang was embroiled in vicious feuds, some against outside rivals and others within their own ranks. By 2002-2003, two major conflicts were brewing that would seal the Westies' fate. The Westies' first big war ignited over a drug deal gone sour. They had once partnered with a gang from the south side of Dublin, often referred to as the Crumlin Gang, to share drug supply lines. But greed and mistrust corroded the alliance. In April 2003, a North Dublin drug dealer named Paul Ryan, who had connections to the Westies' business, was found murdered execution-style in County Offaly. Gardaí suspected the Westies were behind Ryan's killing, possibly as a message to their wavering associates. This act poured gasoline on an already tense relationship with their Dublin rivals. Soon after, the Crumlin Gang, led by rival kingpins from South Inner City, struck back. They allegedly targeted the Westies' leadership in retaliation, sparking a tit-for-tat cycle of violence. By mid-2003, West Dublin was bracing for an all-out gang war between the Westies and a coalition of enemies from Clonsilla, Crumlin, and beyond. Armed detectives warned that any spark could set off an explosion of violence. If they are both back, they are preparing for revenge, one local source said of the Westies' bosses, noting that people are terrified of what might come next. At the same time, a betrayal was brewing inside the gang. The Glennon brothers, Andrew and Mark, had grown dissatisfied with their cut of the profits. They felt Coates and Sugg were keeping too large a slice of the pie. In 2003, the Glennons decided to break away from their mentors. Sensing opportunity, they secretly joined forces with a North Dublin crime outfit, an alliance that reportedly included a notorious drug trafficker named David Babyface Lindsay from Coolock. This defection split the Westies into factions. On one side, Coates and the Sugg brothers. On the other, the Glennons backed by new powerful friends. The bad blood was immediate and intense. What had been a single gang now became two rival gangs vying for control of West Dublin's drug turf. Late summer 2003 turned into open season. With the Westies' kingpins, Coates and Stephen Sugg suddenly out of the country. More on that soon. The Glennon faction saw its chance to seize power. But first, they needed to eliminate the Westies' lieutenant still on the ground, Bernard Verb Surgy. Bernard was Stephen's younger brother and the acting boss in Blanchardstown, while Coates and Stephen hid abroad. The Glennons knew that as long as Verb was alive, He'd be a rallying point for Westies loyalists, so they made a plan to take him out. On the night of August 18, 2003, Bernard Sugg was having a pint at the Brookwood Inn, a busy pub on Blackcourt Road in Corduff, a local haunt that doubled as the Westies' unofficial headquarters. Around 10:30 p.m., two masked gunmen barged through the door. They knew exactly who they were looking for and even knew where he liked to sit. The gang's crew had a regular table inside the entrance. As soon as Verb spotted the men with balaclavas and guns, he bolted for the exit. It was too late. In the panic, one attacker leveled a handgun and shot Bernard Sugg twice in the chest before he could escape. Patrons dove for cover, drinks went flying, and the pub erupted in screams. One innocent bystander caught a stray bullet in the foot. Amid the chaos, the gunmen showed no concern for human life as they pumped 6 shots into the crowded bar. Bernard Verb Sugg, age 23, collapsed on the floor mortally wounded. He was rushed to a hospital but died within the hour. The hit on Sugg achieved its objective. The Glennon brothers had removed Coates and Sugg's last loyal lieutenant in Dublin. In the power vacuum that followed, the Glennon faction took control of the drug trade in West Dublin. As one account noted grimly, for a brief moment, Andrew and Mark Glennon reigned supreme over the very territories they once enforced for Coates. But their triumph would be short-lived. The underworld is fickle, and yesterday's allies can become tomorrow's executioners. By 2004, West Dublin's Gangland was in turmoil. The original Westies leadership was in hiding abroad. Their protege-turned traitors, the Glennons, were now the top dogs at home, and the feud with the Southside gang was still smouldering in the background. Gun violence skyrocketed. Blanchardstown turned into a war zone of reprisals and hits. As one Irish reporter described at the time, northwest Dublin's violent underbelly was threatening to erupt. Armed Garda units patrolled housing estates in anticipation of the next attack. Ordinary people hunkered down, praying not to get caught in the crossfire. Even as chaos reigned in Dublin, the original Westies bosses were plotting their comeback from afar. In mid-2003, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg fled Ireland to escape intense Garda heat. The catalyst was a dramatic shootout with the Gardaí that spring. In May 2003, Coates and some gang members were surprised by police while hiding out at a rural farmhouse in County Cavan, near the village of Virginia. The Westies had been using the isolated house as a stash pad for weapons and stolen goods. When officers arrived to investigate a tip about a burglary, Coates and his crew opened fire. A wild gun battle ensued in the quiet countryside. Coates was wounded in the exchange, but managed to slip away in the chaos. He knew the net was closing in. The Gardaí were hot on his trail after that narrow escape. Rather than stick around for certain arrest or face retribution from the rival gangs in Dublin, Coates and Stephen Sugg decided to vanish. They first surfaced in Northern Ireland, then made their way to Spain by late 2003. For gangsters on the run, the sunny costas of Spain had become a popular refuge. Coates and Sugg set themselves up around Alicante on the Costa Blanca, a place where many Irish expats and fugitives mingled under the radar. With pockets full of cash, the Westies leaders started living the high life. One report claimed they even invested in local businesses, with one of them owning 2 pubs and a restaurant in the Alicante area. But they weren't simply retiring to sip sangria on the beach. Coates and Sugg were looking to continue their drug enterprise from abroad. Southern Spain offered new opportunities. Large-scale shipments of cocaine and cannabis flowed through the Iberian Peninsula, and plenty of Irish and British gangs were active there. The Westies duo saw a chance to get in on the action, possibly to organize supply lines back to Ireland or to muscle in on the expat drug scene. However, entering an established foreign underworld was a dangerous game. Coates and Sugg brought their Dublin intimidation tactics to Spain, and that didn't sit well with the competition. They were essentially trespassers on someone else's turf. Spanish police later concluded that Coates and Sugg tried to muscle in on the local crime scene, using the same bully boy methods that had served them so well in West Dublin. The pair threw their weight around the Alicante underworld, attempting to take over drug operations run by other gangs. In doing so, they signed their own death warrants. In January 2004, just months after arriving in Spain, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg vanished without a trace. Back in Dublin, underworld rumors swirled that the Westies bosses had been kidnapped or assassinated. Initially, even the Gardaí weren't sure what to believe. Some speculated it was an elaborate hoax, that Coates and Sugg had faked their own abductions to lay low and take the heat off while plotting revenge on their enemies. One detective quipped darkly that this mysterious disappearance was the Spanish job, hinting it might be a con job rather than a real murder. Garda intelligence knew the Westies had plenty of enemies. Was it a rival Irish gang in Spain? The Russian mafia? Colombian cartels? At first, these were only whispers and unconfirmed reports. Months turned into years with no sign of Coates or Sugg. Their families reported them missing. Garda quietly liaised with Europol and the Spanish Civil Guard to investigate, but there was no hard evidence of what happened. In Dublin, however, the underworld had a grim understanding. The Westies' leaders had likely been betrayed and executed on Spanish soil. It wasn't until July 2006 that the truth was confirmed in the most macabre way. That summer, acting on a tip-off from an Irish informant, Spanish police unearthed a makeshift grave beneath a warehouse in the town of Catral, near Alicante. Inside a pit under 6 feet of concrete lay 2 skeletal bodies. DNA tests later confirmed what many suspected. They were the remains of Shane Coates, 31, and Stephen Sugg, 27. The Westies' kingpins had been shot in the head at close range, their bodies dumped and covered over with cement. Spanish investigators described the scene. The men had been likely lured to that warehouse, overwhelmed by attackers, tied up, and summarily executed. A police spokesman in Alicante noted the brutality, saying the victims were each shot in the head and left in a shallow grave, mostly bones, by the time they were found. It was the ultimate betrayal. Coates and Sugg thought they were attending a friendly meeting, perhaps to broker a massive drug deal. In fact, a trap had been set. According to local reports, a rival Irish gang operating in Spain, allegedly one that had merged with former paramilitary members, arranged a phony drug transaction to lure the Westies in. The prize dangled in front of them was huge, a 200-kilogram cache of cannabis to be split or bought. Greed led Coates and Sugg right into the ambush. Once isolated in the warehouse, they were outnumbered and outgunned. The rival gang, likely Dublin criminals who had established themselves on the Costa Blanca, overpowered the Westies, tied them up, and shot them dead. Their bodies were unceremoniously dumped in a pre-dug pit and entombed in concrete under the warehouse floor. In gangland fashion, the hitmen buried the evidence of the crime, literally building over it. Coates and Sugg disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving friends and foes alike to speculate for years. The discovery of their remains in 2006 made international headlines. Ireland's most wanted gang bosses had met a violent end abroad. Spanish and Irish authorities finally had closure on the case. The Westies' leaders had been betrayed and executed by a rival Irish mob, likely as payback for their attempt to take over operations in Spain. As one Garda source put it, they won't find anything unless he is actually dead and his body is found. And now bodies had indeed been found. It was the dramatic climax to the Westies' story, but the bloodletting wasn't over yet. Back in Dublin, even before Coates and Sugg's fates were known, the Westies' gang was unraveling. Bernard Sugg was dead, killed in 2003. Coates and Stephen Sugg were missing, presumed hiding or dead by 2004. That left the Glennon brothers as the last men standing in the Westies' power structure. After Bernard's murder, the Glennons and their new allies, like babyface Lindsay, took over West Dublin's drug business. They enjoyed about a year or so at the top of the heap, but as often happens in gangland, victory quickly gave way to infighting. By 2005, cracks formed between the Glennon brothers and the very partners from North Dublin, who had helped them seize control. Greed, mistrust, or a deal gone bad, whatever the cause, the Glennons became embroiled in a dispute with their new crime partners. The alliance that overthrew the Westies' leaders fell apart, and another deadly feud was sparked. The payback came swift and lethal. In April 2005, Andrew Madsa Glennon, 30, was ambushed and shot dead near his home in Clonee, on the border of West Dublin. Sources say at least 4 gunmen took part in the well-planned hit, a sign that powerful enemies wanted Glennon eliminated. Just 5 months later, in September 2005, his brother Mark Glennon, 32, was gunned down outside his house in Blanchardstown by a lone assassin. In the span of a year, the traitors who had once betrayed the Westies were themselves wiped out. In 2005, the 2 Glennon men were murdered after they became embroiled in a dispute with their new crime partners. One account dryly noted, "Gangland Dublin had come full circle. Every major player from the Westies saga was now either dead or disappeared. It was an extraordinary wipeout. Between 2003 and 2005, 5 key members of the Westies, Shane Coates, Stephen Sugg, Bernard Verb Sugg, and Mark and Andrew Glennon, were all killed. As the Irish Times later summarized, the collective referred to by the media as the Westies are long gone. Almost every one of them is dead. The gang that had once terrified Blanchardstown effectively imploded, brought down by its own violent ethos and the swords of its enemies. The few who weren't dead were behind bars or in hiding. One Garda operation after another had targeted the Westies and their affiliates. By mid-2000s, the authorities, along with rival gunmen, had effectively dismantled the Westies network. Even as the blood was drying on the pavement, the Gardaí continued to round up the remnants. Police had been relentless in pursuing the gang's activities, from the shootout in Cavan to surveillance on known members back in Dublin. Surveillance operations, drug busts, and the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, all played roles in squeezing the gang. Notably, Alan Fatpuss Bradley, operating in the same sphere, was hit with a hefty $750,000 tax demand by KB for his ill-gotten gains, which gives a sense of the money sloshing around. In one dramatic episode in 2011, years after the Westies' collapse, Gardaí got wind that some younger criminals were invoking the Westies' name and trying to reform the gang. This new Westies plot involved a scheme to kidnap a bank worker as part of a robbery, a classic tactic in Dublin's underworld. However, a Garda swoop foiled the revival before it could take off. The police arrested the conspirators and made it clear that the Westies brand would not be making a comeback on their watch. The fearsome gang was history, its surviving members scattered. When the dust settled by the late 2000s, West Dublin's underworld had been irrevocably altered. The Westies were gone, but the drug market they once dominated did not simply disappear. Instead, a power vacuum opened up and many were eager to fill it. For a time, chaos reigned as different factions scrambled for pieces of the Westies' former turf. The feud between Jason J. O'Connor and David Gully Goulding, 2 one-time Westies associates who had grown up stealing cars together, is one small example. These childhood friends turned bitter enemies after the gang's disintegration, with each blaming the other for past betrayals. Their personal war led to further bloodshed in the years after, showing how the ripple effects of the Westies saga continued on local streets. Bigger fish, meanwhile, swam in to claim dominance. In the nearby neighbourhood of Finglas, a veteran gangster, Martin Marlowe Hyland, had been running one of Ireland's largest drug operations in parallel to the Westies' reign. After Hyland was assassinated in late 2006, ironically by his own crew, figures like Alan Fatpuss Bradley stepped into the vacuum. Bradley's Finglas crew and others from North Dublin started taking over the armed robbery and drug rackets that the Westies and Hyland had once controlled. As of the late 2000s, 3 main factions were jostling for supremacy in northwest Dublin's crime world. One led by Fatpuss Bradley, another by a returning armed robber, and a third by an up-and-coming gangster from Finglas's Kippure area. Gangland abhors a vacuum, and the fall of one gang simply meant opportunity for the next. The names and faces changed, but the brutal business continued. On a broader scale, the void left by the Westies was eventually filled by more structured and internationally connected cartels. The late 2000s saw the rise of the Kinahan cartel, a Dublin crime family that expanded into a global drug empire. They, along with other gangs, absorbed much of the Irish drug trade. The chaotic days of the Westies gave way to a more corporate style of organized crime. Yet for all their power, even the big cartels learned lessons from the Westies saga. They saw how internal feuds and reckless violence could bring a gang down in a hail of bullets. In West Dublin communities, the legacy of the Westies is a cautionary tale etched in blood. Older residents still remember the era when the gang's name was enough to make people double-lock their doors at night. The very word Westies became synonymous with savage violence. As one Irish crime reporter noted, the Westies were among the most dangerous of Dublin's organised crime gangs, a mob that dominated the local heroin trade and still operate, even as younger gangs came up behind them. Their story has been recounted in books and documentaries as an example of how quickly a gang can rise and how violently it can fall. Today, West Dublin's streets are quieter than during the Westies' heyday, but the scars remain. Virtually an entire generation of gangland figures from that time is either dead or serving long prison terms. The Westies, in particular, were wiped out so thoroughly that there was hardly anyone left to carry their flag. A 2014 analysis observed that of the gang leaders who made headlines in the early 2000s, almost all are now dead or in jail, with the Westies being the prime example. The void they left was filled, but not by a single successor. Instead, many smaller fires started where one big fire burned out. If there is any silver lining to their demise, it's that the extreme lawlessness they instilled in Blanchardstown was curbed, at least for a while, by their removal. The Gardaí's crackdown and the gang's self-destruction brought a measure of relief to residents who had lived in fear. As of the mid-2010s, Blanchardstown's gang feuds cooled compared to the Westies' era, though new threats always loom on Dublin's crime landscape. Conclusion: a violent chapter in Dublin's underworld. The story of the Westies plays out like a tragic gangster film, except it was all too real. It began with impoverished kids in Dublin's West End looking for kicks and cash, and it ended with those same young men buried in concrete or riddled with bullets. In the span of a few years, Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg built a drug empire on fear, became kings of their domain, and then lost everything. Their gang's meteoric rise was fueled by Ireland's booming economy and insatiable hunger for drugs, while their downfall was fueled by betrayal, vengeance, and an overdose of their own violent medicine. What makes the Westies saga so compelling is its raw, unflinching brutality. This was not a crew interested in subtlety or negotiation. They ruled by the gun and the knife. They kneecapped addicts, abducted rivals, and left bodies in their wake as readily in Dublin as their killers later did to them in Spain. As one Spanish police lieutenant remarked after their bodies were found, the Westies were Dublin's most notorious drug gang, and they met a suitably notorious end. The image of Coates and Sugg's decomposed remains under a warehouse floor is a haunting reminder of where the path of violent crime leads. In the annals of Irish crime, the Westies' reign in the late 1990s and early 2000s stands out for its savagery and its rapid collapse. They were a product of their environment, born into poverty and chaos, but they also created an environment of even greater chaos for their community. The gang's story has been recounted in newspapers, books, and even by word of mouth on Dublin's streets, ensuring their infamy lives on, even if they do not. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of the Westies is a lesson to the gangs that followed. Live by the gun, die by the gun. In the words of one Irish detective reflecting on that era, the Westies are long gone, almost every one of them is dead. Their tale remains a dark chapter in Dublin's underworld history, a blood-soaked saga of power, betrayal, and ruthless crime that will not soon be forgotten by those who lived through it. Dublin, 1986. A surveillance operation closes in on a quiet neighborhood. Garda, Irish police, burst into an apartment in Clontarf to find heroin packets scattered on a table, one of the largest heroin seizures in Irish history at that time. The man arrested is Christy Kinahan, a well-dressed 29-year-old Dubliner. This moment, a massive $117,000 haul of heroin, marks the rise of a drug kingpin who will later be dubbed the Dapper Don. It's the beginning of a criminal empire that will reign over Ireland's underworld for decades. But Christy Kinahan's story starts years before that bust. Born in 1957 to a stable family, his father managed a dairy farm. Christy didn't come from destitution. In fact, unlike many gangland figures, he was relatively well-educated and even drove a taxi in his early years. Yet the young father of two hungered for more than an honest living could provide. By the late 1970s, he had ventured into petty crime, burglary, car theft, forgery, chalking up his first convictions before age 20. This ordinary Dublin lad was slowly metamorphosing into something else, a clever, ambitious criminal with his eyes on bigger prizes. As Dublin's inner city struggled with poverty and drugs in the 1980s, heroin became an epidemic. Kinahan saw opportunity. By the mid-1980s, he had quietly become one of Ireland's major heroin suppliers, networking with suppliers and outsmarting rivals. The 1986 Clontarf seizure, at the time a record haul, put him behind bars for 6 years, but it also cemented his underworld reputation. Media would later nickname him the Dapper Don, likening him to New York's infamous John Gotti for his suave appearance and ability to evade serious convictions. He was no street thug. Christy Kinahan was calculating, polished, and patient. Kinahan served his prison term in the late 1980s, but incarceration did little to slow his ascent. In some ways, it sharpened it. Behind bars, Christie capitalized on his time. He earned 2 degrees and even learned to speak Spanish and Russian. Fellow inmates saw a quiet man immersed in books, not realizing he was preparing for a new era of international crime. By the time he refused early release in 2001, just to finish a degree, Kinahan had transformed himself into a multilingual, educated crime strategist. Not the typical gang boss at all, as Irish papers later noted. His education would prove invaluable for what came next. The 1990s brought the Celtic Tiger, an economic boom in Ireland, and with newfound wealth came surging demand for drugs. Cocaine began flooding Dublin's party scene, and various gangs fought deadly turf wars for control of this lucrative trade. While Kinahan's early focus had been heroin, he had the foresight to pivot. After a brush with the law in 1993 over a cache of stolen checks, for which he fled Ireland while on bail, Christie lay low. In 1997, he was dramatically arrested at his own father's funeral in Dublin, an outstanding warrant finally catching up with him. He was jailed again, this time for 4 years on the check fraud charges. This might have been the end for some criminals, but for Christie it was an opportunity. In prison, he refined his plans, emerging in the early 2000s with a grander vision: to build an international drug pipeline beyond the reach of Irish authorities. To understand the Kinahan cartel's rise, one must understand the fallout from a single event: the 1996 murder of journalist Veronica Guerin. Guerin's assassination by drug traffickers shocked Ireland and led to the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, a unit dedicated to seizing criminals' wealth. Under intense heat from CAB, many Irish kingpins fled abroad to keep their fortunes. Christie Kinahan was among them. Sensing that staying in Dublin was now too risky, he upped sticks around the year 2000 and relocated his operations to the sun-soaked haven of Spain's Costa del Sol. He and other gang leaders set up shop in places like Marbella and Amsterdam, where they could run their businesses from afar. This exile was strategic. In Spain, Kinahan was out of cabby's reach and off the Irish tabloids' front pages. And crucially, in those early years abroad, he kept violence to a minimum, a calculated move to avoid drawing attention from Spanish law enforcement. Through the late 1990s and 2000s, Christie Kinahan quietly consolidated power. While gangland feuds raged on Dublin streets, from the lethal Westies gang in West Dublin to the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, Kinahan stayed in the shadows, supplying many sides with drugs. Rival Irish gangs were killing each other in record numbers. Some years saw over 20 gangland murders. But Kinahan's crew was different. They became the wholesale suppliers, the shadowy brokers. By the mid-2000s, most of Ireland's drug traffickers were effectively working for the Kinahan cartel, whether they knew it or not, distributing ported cocaine and cannabis, and kicking up profits to the big boss abroad. One Irish assistant police commissioner would later describe Christie's growing network as a huge crime conglomerate that had reached an unprecedented size and power in the Irish underworld. Christie embedded himself on the Costa del Sol, living in a luxe villa in Estepona worth millions. Fluent in Spanish, he blended into the expat high life. He forged ties with Spanish smugglers, North African hashish suppliers, and even established routes for Colombian and Mexican cartels, and the Russian mafia to push drugs into Europe. If cocaine was the gold of the new century, Kinahan positioned himself as one of its chief European prospectors. Ireland was a key market, but not the only one. The Kinahan reach extended to the UK and mainland Europe by the late 2000s. While Christie managed logistics abroad, trusted lieutenants, some of them childhood friends from Dublin, handled distribution and kept order back home. Violence was used sparingly and strategically. In these years, Christie's name rarely made headlines. He was the invisible hand moving multi-million euro shipments of cocaine and cannabis, while other gangs took the heat. By 2010, law enforcement across Europe had begun to grasp the enormity of Christie Kinahan's enterprise. That year, Operation Shovel was launched, a massive international crackdown on the Kinahan cartel. In May 2010, coordinated raids in Spain, Ireland, and the UK nabbed over 30 suspects, including Christie himself. At long last, it seemed the elusive Dapper Don was cornered. Spanish police hauled Kinahan in, and newspapers splashed stories of an Irish godfather taken down on the Costa del Sol. But the victory was short-lived. To the amazement of many, no significant charges stuck. Christie spent only a few months behind bars in Spain before walking free due to lack of evidence. Operation Shovel had rattled the cartel, but ultimately failed to land a knockout blow. Christie Kinahan returned to his villa and his business as usual, likely more cautious but also more confident that his low-key, sophisticated model could withstand even international scrutiny. By the end of the 2000s, the Kinahan cartel had risen from Dublin streets to become a global juggernaut. Christie Dapper Don Kinahan, once a small-time burglar, was now, according to Irish authorities, the head of the most powerful organised crime group Ireland had ever seen. His organisation sat atop an estimated $1 billion empire built on drugs, fear and corruption. With a foothold in Ireland, the UK, Spain and beyond, the stage was set for the next chapter, the expansion under the next generation of Kinahan, and the inevitable challenges to their throne. It's the late 2000s on Spain's Costa del Sol. Luxury yachts bob in Marbella's marina, and high rollers sip champagne at beachfront clubs. Behind the glitz, Christie Kinahan's cartel is thriving in the shadows. Having survived Operation Shovel, the Kinahans now supercharge their global expansion. This era will see the cartel morph into a transnational drug and arms powerhouse, with alliances spanning continents, and Christie's eldest son, Daniel Kinahan, stepping forward as the new face of the empire. By the early 2010s, Daniel Kinahan was taking over day-to-day operations of the family business. Groomed by Christie, Daniel had learned the trade young and inherited his father's smarts and ambition. He was nothing if not bold, and he had a passion that would define this chapter of expansion: boxing. But before the boxing rings and Las Vegas fights, Daniel cut his teeth in the cartel's core business: drugs, guns, and money. Under Christie's guidance, he helped strengthen partnerships with other underworld titans. The Kinahan cartel became a key player in what Europol later called a European super cartel, a consortium of the biggest drug lords cooperating to dominate the cocaine trade. Kinahan emissaries struck deals with South American suppliers, including allegedly El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. They linked up with Italy's Camorra and 'Ndrangheta, British crime families, Dutch kingpins, Moroccan hashish smugglers, even paramilitary groups like Hezbollah, anyone who could help move product or launder money. This was organized crime on a global scale. Cocaine from Colombia and Venezuela, cannabis resin from North Africa, precursors from Asia, all found their way into Kinahan pipelines, snaking through ports in Spain, Rotterdam, Antwerp, and beyond. With drug profits soaring, the cartel diversified into arms trafficking. Guns were the lifeblood of gangland power, and the Kinahans ensured their foot soldiers and their allies were well supplied. They sourced AK-47s, submachine guns, pistols, and grenades from conflict zones and black markets, smuggling arms alongside drug shipments. In one UK case, a Kinahan lieutenant named Thomas Bomber Kavanagh stockpiled a cache of 11 deadly firearms, including assault rifles, as part of a plot to curry favor with authorities, a scheme that ultimately failed, landing him additional prison time. The cartel's gun running wasn't just for profit. It fortified their influence among other gangs by acting as an armorer and made sure they could eliminate rivals or traitors decisively. Europol reports later linked the Kinahan group to murders in at least 4 countries, illustrating how violence was a tool that extended far beyond Ireland. As the drug money poured in, Christie and Daniel expertly laundered the illicit fortune. They invested in property, villas in Spain, Dubai high-rises, and set up front companies across the world. In Dubai, where the Kinahan presence was growing, Daniel and his brother even established companies trading in food, clothing, and consulting, often with local partners to gain legitimacy. Money moved through offshore accounts and cash couriers. Some funds may have gone through the Hawala system in the Middle East, informal value transfer networks that leave little trace. The goal was to turn dirty cash into ostensibly legitimate assets. By the mid-2010s, the Kinahans had entrenched themselves in the United Arab Emirates, particularly Dubai, which offered a luxurious sanctuary with no extradition treaties covering their crimes. Cartel money was also funneled into businesses in Africa and Asia, truly a global laundry cycle for their euros. Despite this sprawling criminal enterprise, Daniel Kinahan sought something more: respectability and public influence. Boxing was his vehicle. In 2012, Daniel co-founded a boxing management company in Marbella, originally known as MGM, Macklin's Gym Marbella, and later rebranded as MTK Global. This wasn't a vanity project, it was a shrewd move to intertwine the Kinahan empire with a legitimate sport. MTK Global quickly signed dozens of fighters, including world champions. Daniel, who had a genuine love for boxing, became an advisor to fighters and began rubbing shoulders with the sport's elite. By the late 2010s, Daniel Kinahan was a power broker in boxing, arranging high-profile fights and managing big names. He was photographed with heavyweight champion Tyson Fury and veteran promoter Bob Arum, and he courted the likes of UFC star Conor McGregor, even if that feud was more tabloid fodder than serious beef. For a while, it seemed Daniel had pulled off an incredible double life. As one crime analyst noted, by 2020 he had become one of the most influential figures in the boxing sport, all while Irish courts identified him as a key cocaine and firearms trafficker behind the scenes. This strategy of mingling with the legitimate world paid dividends. Daniel cultivated an image as a businessman and fight organizer, which gave him political connections and a sheen of credibility. It also served the cartel. Boxing events provided cover for meetings with other criminals, and maybe even a route to launder money via event revenues and fighter management fees. At one point, the Kinahans were so emboldened that in February 2016, they hosted a lavish Clash of the Clans boxing event at Dublin's Regency Hotel, with Daniel present, a decision that would soon have bloody consequences, to be continued in Part 3. But up until that fateful event, the Kinahan name was not widely known to the public outside of crime reporters. Daniel largely kept to the shadows, often described only as a MTK advisor, while MTK Global's public heads insisted he had officially stepped away from the company in 2017. Behind closed doors, though, his influence was unmistakable. In 2020, WBC President Mauricio Sulaiman bizarrely praised Daniel Kinahan for improving boxers' lives, a sign of how deeply Daniel had woven himself into the fabric of the sport. And when Tyson Fury thanked Dan for securing a major fight deal in a video message, it sparked outrage in Ireland that a crime boss was being openly celebrated in sports media. Even as Daniel pushed the Kinahan brand into new arenas, the core business of the cartel kept booming. Europol and police agencies were seeing record cocaine shipments hitting Europe year after year. By now, the Kinahans were known as pivotal players in importing these drugs, not necessarily owning every shipment, but acting as key brokers and facilitators. One international investigation revealed the sheer scale: 3 tons of cocaine, 700 kilos of cannabis resin, and even a custom-built narco submarine seized in Spain were all linked to a Kinahan-driven network. The cartel, working with other groups, could summon literally shiploads of cocaine from Latin America. In Ireland, police noted an insatiable appetite for cocaine that the Kinahans and others were feeding. The gang's wealth and reach had become so vast that by the mid-2010s, authorities dubbed them a transnational criminal organization, an Irish mob gone global. However, with great power came great enemies. The Kinahan cartel's expansion wasn't unchallenged. Other crime families envied or resented their dominance. Chief among them was the Dublin-based Hutch gang, led by veteran thief Jerry the Monk Hutch. For years, the Kinahans and Hutches coexisted in an uneasy peace. Rumor has it they even collaborated on certain heists and shared profits in the past. But tensions simmered. Daniel and his brother built their own crew of loyalists in Dublin, while the Hutch family had its own criminal interests. The Kinahans had also made internal enemies. Occasionally, a trusted associate fell out of favor, and Daniel, less diplomatic than his father, was not one to forgive a perceived betrayal. By 2014-2015, whispers in the underworld hinted at a looming storm between the Kinahans and Hutch factions. The spark would come from within. Gary Hutch, Jerry Hutch's nephew, had been an ally of the Kinahans, working with them on the Costa del Sol. But something went sour. Reports vary, but Garda sources later said the Kinahans grew suspicious that Gary Hutch was skimming money or even acting as a police informant, a claim believed to be false. Worse, they thought Gary plotted to assassinate a Kinahan lieutenant in a dispute. Daniel Kinahan's response was deadly. A hit was ordered on Gary. An attempt on Gary's life failed in 2014, leading to frantic negotiations between the Kinahan and Hutch families. In a remarkable deal, the Hutch side paid a large six-figure sum, hush money, to the Kinahans to spare Gary's life, and Gary agreed to leave the drug trade. For a time, it appeared the issue was resolved. Gary returned to Spain, thinking the slate was clean. But the deal was a trap. On the morning of September 24, 2015, as Gary Hutch exercised by a swimming pool in Miraflores, Marbella, a gunman chased him down and shot him dead. The Kinahan cartel had betrayed the peace agreement and murdered the 34-year-old Gary in cold blood. It was a brazen betrayal that would light the fuse on a war. By late 2015, word of Gary Hutch's execution, essentially at Daniel Kinahan's behest, reverberated through Dublin's underworld. Jerry Monk Hutch was reportedly devastated and furious at his nephew's slaying. Quiet, calculating Jerry began plotting revenge from the shadows. The stage was set for a deadly feud that would explode onto international headlines and ultimately threaten the very existence of the Kinahan Empire. February 5, 2016, Regency Hotel, Dublin. It's mid-afternoon at a boxing weigh-in event for an MTK-promoted fight. The lobby is crowded with fans, families, and fighters. Among the crowd is Daniel Kinahan, attending the event he helped organize, surrounded by his associates. Suddenly, a man disguised as a woman in a wig pulls an AK-47 from a handbag, while across the room, gunmen outfitted in fake police tactical gear storm in with rifles. Pandemonium erupts. People dive for cover as gunfire echoes through the hotel's halls. The target is clear, the Kinahan contingent. When the chaos subsides, Daniel Kinahan is nowhere to be found. He narrowly escapes unharmed in the melee. But one of his close associates, David Byrne, lies dead on the marble floor. Byrne, a 34-year-old Kinahan lieutenant, was riddled with bullets in front of dozens of witnesses. The Regency Hotel attack was like a scene from a movie. But it was brutally real, a retaliation by Hutch-aligned hitmen for the murder of Gary Hutch. It was the opening salvo in what became Ireland's bloodiest gangland feud. And for the Kinahan cartel, it marked the beginning of their downfall. The Hutch-Kinahan feud that erupted in 2016 would leave a trail of bodies and attract unprecedented law enforcement attention. Just 72 hours after the Regency attack, the Kinahan side struck back. On February 8, 2016, Eddie Hutch Sr., Jerry Hutch's older brother, was gunned down at his home in Dublin's north inner city. He was unarmed, an easy target. Assassins pumped bullets into him in retaliation for David Byrne's death. Over the next weeks and months, a tit-for-tat cycle of murder gripped Dublin. The Kinahan hit teams, often young men on mopeds or stolen cars, faces masked, roamed the streets, hunting anyone connected to the Hutches. They killed Noel King-Size Duggan, a longtime friend of Jerry Hutch, in March 2016, as he sat in his car. In April, they shot dead Martin O'Rourke, a young man mistakenly identified as a Hutch associate, in broad daylight. An innocent victim caught in the carnage. Michael Barr, who had unknowingly helped the Regency hit squad, was executed at a pub in April 2016. In May, Gareth Hutch, Jerry's nephew, was murdered in his apartment parking lot as he buckled his child into a car seat. By the end of 2016, at least 11 men lay dead in this feud, most of them shot in the head on Dublin's streets. The once shadowy Kinahan cartel was now front-page news daily, its violence exposed for all to see. The sheer brazenness of the Kinahans during the feud stunned Ireland. It was as if Daniel Kinahan and his cohorts were trying to send a message, or perhaps scrambling to quash the Hutch threat through terror. But each killing only steeled Jerry Hutch's resolve for revenge. He and his network struck back where they could, though more of the bloodshed was Kinahan on Hutch. By 2017, the toll had climbed. 18 lives would be lost to the feud by 2021. The Irish public, watching this mob war play out, grew both fearful and angry. And the Garda, who had long faced criticism for not doing enough against big gangsters, launched an unprecedented crackdown. Specialized task forces were set up, armed officers patrolled vulnerable neighborhoods, and the government poured resources into stopping the cycle. For the Kinahans, this intense heat was something they had largely avoided when they operated from abroad quietly. Now they were labeled Ireland's public enemy, such a one. International authorities also started closing in. The Kinahan-Hutch feud had spillover outside Ireland. Gary Hutch was killed in Spain. A Kinahan hit team planned to kill Hutch family members on the Costa del Sol. Even Spain's Guardia Civil and Interpol were drawn into the case, sharing intel with the Irish. The Hutch side wasn't innocent either. In 2018, Hutch associates in Spain were caught with a hit list targeting Kinahan leaders, a plot foiled by Spanish police. The European authorities, now fully aware of the Kinahan presence in their backyard, began cooperating in ways never seen before. This narco-terror on EU soil simply could not be ignored. Meanwhile, key operatives of the Kinahan cartel started falling. In August 2017, Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, effectively the Kinahans' UK boss, was arrested after NCA agents found 23 kilos of cocaine and 8 guns linked to his crew. He was later sentenced to 21 years in a British prison for drug trafficking, a major blow to the cartel's UK branch. Other trusted lieutenants met grim fates. In September 2018, hitman Freddie Thompson was convicted in Dublin of a feud-related murder and sent to prison for life. Irish and Spanish police also targeted the cartel's money men. They raided properties, seizing luxury cars, cash and ledgers. The noose was tightening around the Kinahan organization. However, the leadership, Christie, Daniel and Christie Jr., remained elusive, sheltered abroad. By 2017, all 3 Kinahans were believed to be in Dubai, enjoying the high life in a city that, at the time, offered them a safe harbor. Daniel continued to dabble in boxing from afar and reportedly held meetings with other cartel figures in the UAE. It seemed like the Kinahans might weather even this storm by lying low overseas. That turned out to be wishful thinking. As the feud raged, pressure built for a coordinated international response. In April 2022, that response came. In a dramatic press conference in Dublin on April 12, 2022, flanked by Irish police and Europol officials, the US ambassador to Ireland, Claire Cronin, announced US sanctions against the Kinahan cartel and something even more staggering: a $5 million bounty on each of the 3 Kinahan leaders. The Kinahans were now formally designated by the US as a significant transnational criminal organization, their bank accounts frozen, their names blacklisted worldwide. Ambassador Cronin didn't mince words. The reward was for information leading to the financial destruction of the Kinahan organized crime group, or the arrest and conviction of Christie, Daniel or Christopher Jr. It was unprecedented for the US government to target an Irish gang, a sign of just how big and international the Kinahans had become and how serious the threat was perceived. In the wake of the sanctions, the fallout was immediate. Dubai, under heavy diplomatic pressure, reportedly froze assets and bank accounts tied to the Kinahans. Their business partners scampered away. Within days, Daniel Kinahan's pride and joy, MTK Global, ceased operations entirely, citing unprecedented scrutiny and inability to continue when its founder was sanctioned. Fighters were left managerless, gyms shut down. The Kinahan name was now poison in any legitimate circle. Tyson Fury and other boxers hastily distanced themselves from Daniel, with public warnings from law enforcement that anyone who dealt with Kinahan was effectively consorting with criminals. The message from the top was clear: no more impunity. These moves dealt a hammer blow to the cartel's finances and freedom of movement. Christie Kinahan Sr., who was about 65 by then, and his 2 sons suddenly found themselves hunted men. The US, Irish, British and EU authorities had formed a multi-country task force laser-focused on dismantling the Kinahan enterprise. As one Irish assistant commissioner put it in 2023, the Kinahan cartel has been substantially degraded by successive operations by Irish, British, Spanish and US authorities. Years of investigations were now bearing fruit. Over $2 million in cash was seized in Ireland in various raids. Properties worth far more were confiscated or frozen. Even the Kinahans' legendary ability to hide money was meeting its match as financial documents and encrypted phone messages from networks like EncroChat were intercepted. EncroChat, an encrypted phone system favored by criminals, had been secretly compromised by European police in 2020, yielding a treasure trove of evidence. Among the intercepted chats were communications of Kinahan operatives coordinating drug shipments and hits. This intel directly led to high-profile arrests. In 2023, Liam Byrne, one of Daniel's most trusted men and the head of the Kinahan faction in Ireland, Josh UK, was lured out of Dubai and arrested in Spain while dining with family. Byrne, whose own brother David was the one killed at the Regency, was wanted for weapons trafficking. The UK's NCA had evidence, thanks to EncroChat, that Byrne and an associate were sourcing pistols and submachine guns for the cartel. Irish police hailed Byrne's capture as a particularly significant development in the effort to dismantle the Kinahan gang. Alongside him, a younger Kinahan associate, Jack Kavanagh, no relation to Thomas Kavanagh, coincidentally, was nabbed in a Dubai airport transit, caught trying to slip away to Turkey. One by one, the dominoes were falling. Law enforcement on multiple continents were now in daily cooperation. A senior Garda officer in 2023 noted that agencies from the US to Colombia to the UAE were sharing intel like never before. Relationships we never had before. Now we can pick up the phone anytime, day or night, he said of the new United Front. The Garda even expanded liaison posts to Dubai and Colombia, embedding officers to coordinate the hunt. The Kinahans, who once exploited international gaps, found no safe haven. Christy Kinahan was reportedly forced to flee his luxury Dubai base and move frequently. There were sightings of him in places like Zimbabwe and Oman, looking for refuge, but nowhere is truly safe with a $5 million tag on one's head and the combined might of Western law enforcement in pursuit. By 2025, the mighty Kinahan cartel is a shell of its former self. Assistant Commissioner Justin Kelly stated the gang is no longer the dominant force it once was, and has been largely degraded by relentless operations. Their drug routes and contacts still exist, but many have been taken over by others or disrupted. Crucially, the Kinahans' ability to orchestrate violence has been blunted. Their hitmen are dead or jailed, their bankrolls under siege. We have made it difficult for the Kinahan leaders to fund or organize any hit teams again, Kelly explained, noting that assassinations require big money and logistics that the cartel can no longer easily muster. Indeed, the once unending feud with the Hutches finally petered out, as the Kinahan side could not sustain the campaign of murder under intense police pressure. In a twist of fate, Gerry Hutch was put on trial in 2022 for the Regency Hotel killing of David Byrne. But in 2023, he was acquitted due to lack of evidence, walking free from court while the Kinahans remained in hiding. The Irish police, however, have not forgotten the Kinahans' many crimes and vow to pursue them to the end. We will continue until the cartel is dismantled, Commissioner Drew Harris has pledged. Today, Christy Kinahan, now in his late 60s, and his sons Daniel, mid-40s, and Christopher Jr. remain fugitives, believed to be laying low in the Middle East. The US State Department's $5 million rewards still stand, and over 600 associates and suspected collaborators have been barred from entering the United States as part of the crackdown, a testament to how far the US is willing to go to isolate them. The Kinahan family's empire, once a well-oiled machine pumping drugs across Europe, is fractured. Many of their closest allies are imprisoned, from Irish gunmen to British smugglers, thanks to joint investigations. Internationally, their old partners in crime have largely cut ties to avoid the spotlight now shining on the super cartel. But the story isn't over until it's truly over. The Kinahans have proven resourceful in the past, surviving arrests, betrayals, even gangland wars. Irish authorities caution that while severely weakened, it would be naive to think they're out of business entirely. Still, the momentum is against the Kinahans now. Fortune no longer favors the dapper Don. The man who once strode freely in Marbella and Dubai now has to look over his shoulder at every turn. From humble Dublin origins to a global crime empire, the Kinahan cartel rode a wave of greed, violence, and audacity to the very top. only to find law enforcement and vengeful rivals waiting there to knock them down. In the end, the Kinahan saga is a cautionary tale, a story of power and hubris, of a criminal dynasty that rose from the streets to build a narco superpower. They left in their wake countless lives ruined by drugs, a trail of bodies from Dublin to Spain, and a legacy that authorities are hell-bent on erasing. As of this narration, the net continues to close. It may take time. As one detective said, dismantling the Kinahan cartel will take a lot of time and painstaking work, but the writing is on the wall. The fall of the Kinahan cartel is underway, piece by piece, and justice, slowly but surely, is catching up with the Dapper Don and his sons.